Okay, all right. So welcome to the fall 2023 conference of the Working Group on Mormonism and Western Esotericism. I'm Trevor Luke, and I'll kind of be hosting this evening. We have four wonderful speakers, and I've asked to roughly speak about 20 minutes, but I know one of our speakers may be coming as late as 8:50 Eastern Standard Time, so that may allow us to expatiate a little bit if everyone's agreed that that's okay. Our first speaker this evening is Dr. Stephen Fleming, who's a PhD, is from the University of California at Santa Barbara, studied under Ann Taves, and really wrote his dissertation squarely in this area of Mormonism and Western Esotericism. It's a fantastic dissertation, so find it, read it, study it. And I've had the privilege of talking to Stephen for a good bit of time. He's presented a couple of times here, and he's given wonderful presentations. He will be our first speaker this evening. Stephen, if you take it away. Do you have a PowerPoint, Stephen? Can you hear me? I don't think he's hearing me.
All right, sorry. Yes, I do.
Oh, okay. All right. You have a PowerPoint?
I do.
Okay, let me get you set up here.
Okay.
With hosting. All right. All right, so now you should be able to
share the screen. All right.
Share.
All right, thank you, Trevor. All righty. Let's see. Let's go to get this thing started. There we are. All righty. So yeah, Trevor, last when we had what do we call the thing that I did in the fall versus what we're doing now?
That's a good question. Yeah.
So we did that thing in the fall. That was just me, and I gave a very long presentation. And thank you for indulging me on I guess I don't know, maybe you should have cut me off or something, but yeah, I gave a very long presentation. And so when Trevor put up, kind of a call for this, I had, because I'm still plugging away, it was part of this larger project. It's now growth of my dissertation, which has taken a very, very long time, turned out to be a huge project. And, Joseph Smith's intellectual thought and influences, big topic. And so, I had kind of the thought that, that I wanted to share, and then I had done some more and found some more stuff, and thought I kind of, so in a lot of ways, this is connected to that paper that I gave, and I'll put up which in case, I don't know if you guys saw it or not, but I'm going to be making a lot of references to the presentation I gave back in the fall. And so in a lot of ways, it's kind of an addendum to that. Okay. And what I'm looking to explore here is, I think, is a concept that I'm going to be arguing in the book was, my opinion, very important, both to Joseph Smith and just what Mormonism is, and this creation, this religion. And it's this idea of ancient religion. And it isn't just it isn't something like, it's a concept that we don't really have these days, right? It's not just like, thinking about old religions and stuff, but it's a particular theme that was around and discussed much in Joseph Smith's day. It's kind of disappeared somewhat nowadays, but so it's something that I talked about in the previous paper, and I wanted to follow up on and expand a little bit, because one of the things that I had found was that I believe this does connect to Book of Mormon themes, and this is something that I talked about in that paper I gave in the fall. Book of Mormon themes, particularly things that we'll see with the Nephites and the Jaredites. Okay. And anyway, I'll go ahead and lay that out. Let me just go grab my cup of water here, and we'll see how coherent this is. But yeah, like I said, I will need to refer to previous paper that I gave. So like I said, a lot of this is an addendum. All right. So in Ether 3, right, we have the brother of Jared having his remarkable vision of the premortal Christ, right? And Jesus, it's the whole thing about bringing the stones and seeing the body and all this stuff. And then it suddenly says, Jesus starts to teach him things, and all of a sudden Moroni, who's the one who's summarizing this account of Ether, says, I could not make a full account of these things, right? These things which are written, right? Can't tell you everything that the Lord is going to tell the brother of Jared, right? And then when we get to chapter 5, the Lord hath commanded me to write them, and he commanded me that I should seal them up. And so this is the sealed portion, right? We're told that there's a sealed portion, and it's this teaching that Jesus had given the brother of Jared, and so Moroni had it. He had it. The Nephites had this, at least those who had the Jaredite record, but he doesn't give it to us. It's not in the Book of Mormon, right? These extra teachings. And then it says in verse 7, in the day that they shall exercise faith in me, saith the Lord, even as the brother of Jared did, then will I manifest unto them the things which the brother of Jared saw, right? So there's this idea of there's this higher teaching, right? That the brother of Jared knew, Moroni knew, those in the Book of Mormon who had this record had this additional teaching that we don't. Okay, and this is related to other themes that we see in the Book of Mormon. For instance, and the brother of Jared's vision is connected to this, right? Because it says one of the things that Jesus does when he talks to the brother of Jared, it says in the chapter 3, verse 18. Jesus ministered unto the brother of Jared, even as he ministered unto the Nephites. So as we know, Jesus comes to the Nephites and ministers to them. And what that's significant, I believe, because we see a very similar kind of thing that happens. When Mormon is summarizing Jesus's teaching to the Nephites, he says, these things I have written, which are a lesser part of the things which he taught the people. And then if it shall be that they shall believe these things, then shall greater things be made manifest unto them. So we have a similar kind of theme. Jesus teaches more things. Mormon edits them out, right? Because just like we see with Moroni and the brother of Jared's vision, right? You need to have their kind of faith in order to receive this additional higher teaching, right? So that the Nephites have more, the Jaredites have more, but they don't write it down in the Book of Mormon. And this is kind of interesting, right? So bring up the question, right? What did they have, right? What was it? What was it they were taught? Now, one aspect of it that actually says in both places was that Jesus reveals all history to them, right? And of course, that's a little bit difficult. How do you write down all history into a book, particularly a single volume, if you just go look at the library? But that's not what I'm going to try to tackle, the history of everything. But also I think that it does really hit at that there's these further higher doctrines, okay, that will not be written down in the Book of Mormon. Now, this is again where I really want to reference the paper that I gave, back in the fall, right? So here it is. I have it listed out here. If you type this into YouTube, Joe Smith, The Ancient Religion, or Where Was There a Hemla, right? So look that up if you haven't seen it, right? Because I'm going to be referring to that. Okay. Now it does take I am coming at this from not believing the Book of Mormon is historical. Okay. I am a practicing Mormon though. Just FYI, but the premise is that I believe that Joseph Smith draws on sources, right, for the Book of Mormon, and that in the sources that he draws on, that I believe he uses in producing the Book of Mormon, has a lot of the Nauvoo doctrine, right? There's still some things that he needs to work out, but a whole lot of the things that we would think of the Nauvoo doctrine, I'm arguing that he had become aware of prior to producing the Book of Mormon. So we're talking in the 1820s, he had come across a whole lot of these things, right? Things like the plan of salvation, right? This whole thing, coming to earth, etc., right? The more complex afterlife, deification, really a big one. So that my argument is that a whole lot of the Nauvoo doctrine, again, maybe not every piece of it, but most, he was aware of at the time of the writing of the Book of Mormon, and that I actually put, if you see again, see the presentation I gave in the fall, right? My argument is that Joe Smith actually hints at a handful of these doctrines, and I'll go through actually a few of them, right, in this paper, but I go through them a little more detail. So things like preexistence, I believe he's hinting at. I believe he's hinting at deification in the Book of Mormon, and that even concepts of more complicated marriage patterns. Okay, and so that a lot of the again, so and when you see the parallels between Book of Mormon themes, they line up with sources that he's using that do talk about, again, this kind of doctrine. So my sense is that just as Joe Smith believed that the Book of Mormon authors were needing to conceal the higher truth, this was the higher truth that he himself was aware of. Okay, and so that is my premise, is to believe that when he's saying, what are the things I'm not going to reveal, the Book of Mormon authors are saying, my sense is it's probably this stuff. It's probably a lot of this Nauvoo doctrine. Okay, that is what I believe he's concealing, right? And I even refer to this as, I believe he kind of thinking of this as these higher doctrines as the fullness of the gospel. That then brought us into some debate of exactly what would that term mean. So I'm not going to stress that term so much in this presentation, but just I'll probably just call it higher doctrine here. Okay. So one of the things, again, I pointed this out in the other paper, that I do believe was one of his sources, is Plato. Okay, and I know that sounds strange to a lot of people, but do see my other presentation, because I go through why, and I'll summarize that quickly here, right? But one of the things is that every single one of those higher doctrines, right, is in Plato's writings, right? They're all there, and I believe that's a major place where he got them, right? And again, I'll kind of go through that in more detail in the other paper, and I'll give you a little quick summary here. But one of the things I do think is interesting is again, we do have these commands that come out in some statements in the Doctrine and Covenants, particularly 88, where there is this command to study, right? And one of the ones I point out in 88 is this line: teach one another the doctrines of the kingdom, of things in heaven and in earth and under the earth. And that this is actually the charge, very similar to the charge against Socrates in the Apology, right? The main charge is that he's corrupting the youth, and that he's teaching other spiritual things rather than the more orthodox Greek theology. But one of the lines that he's charged with is that Socrates acts wickedly and with criminal curiosity, investigates things under the earth, right, and in the heavens, and he teaches these things to others. So that this injunction that Joseph Smith, that we get in D&C 88, is very, very similar to this charge against Socrates. My argument is that this is not random. This was deliberate, because Plato plays a major role in Joseph Smith's doctrine. Okay, and so what my argument is that this is a part of a larger book, right? I'm working on Joseph Smith's. I'm calling it an intellectual biography of Joseph Smith. Intellectual biography meaning where does he get his ideas, and how are these things drawn upon? Okay, and again, this works for, again, practicing Mormon. So this works, because his scriptures say you're supposed to go and study. So my argument is I believe he did that, and so just kind of want to trace, what he might have done. Okay, and one of the lines I think is really significant is that in the transcript we have of the 1826 trial, the first time he's brought up on trial for treasure digging, they ask him at the trial, what do you spend most of your time doing? Because he says, yeah, I just do a little bit of treasure digging. Most of the time I work for Stoll on his farm and going to school. And what I pointed out in the previous paper is, if you look at the grammar, it even kind of suggests, perhaps, if you line those two things together, not only that he's going to school, and that's verified in other sources, but that the employment he's doing for Stoll could be, going to school could be part of that. And I pointed out that having a good educated treasure digger was actually highly desired, because you're supposed to be learned in these occult books, right? The grimoires and whatnot. And pointing out that he's 20 when he's doing this, when most the formal education that you would do, for regular people who aren't going to college, which is almost everybody, you were usually stopping that at 16. So the fact that he's still going at 20 means he isn't just going through the motions. I believe that this is like a deliberate act of trying to get more education. And it even suggests that Stoll himself might have been bankrolling this. I mean, or at least, supporting Smith to get this education because you wanted an educated treasure seeker, right? Now, and in getting this education, he would have, again, there's sort of this notion nowadays that Plato's this very ivory tower stuff that only, Harvard dons are interested in, and the truth is that's not quite accurate. For instance, if you're a cult treasure digger, you would be reading grimoires, which is really important in this to be a treasure digger, and they make lots and lots of references to Plato, right? There's this notion that the Neoplatonists were the experts on spirits, and that spirits were a key aspect of the process of treasure digging because they tended to be guarded by treasures tend to be guarded by spirits, right? And then another place to run into Plato is the family important aspect of family religion was universalism. His father, his grandfather, and the knights, who again in 26, he's associating a whole lot with the knights, were all universalists, and universalists would make lots of references to Plato. Now, again, I go over this in more detail in that other presentation, okay? And this would then lead us to this concept of ancient religion, okay? And what scholars would now refer to it is is the Latin term that they used in the Renaissance, which is Prisca Theologia. That's not the term that Joseph Smith would have run into. So in a way, Prisca Theologia is a little bit of gets a little off track because it makes us assume that this is only a Renaissance concept. The concept was a very alive and well in Joseph Smith's day, and there was lots of debate on it. They usually would use the term ancient theology, was usually the term that was used for it, but sometimes they would use the term ancient religion, and they meant something very specific. They didn't necessarily mean just anthropological stuff that sort of develops of primitive man. What they meant was this second paragraph, believe that there had been a universal truth that went back to the great sages, right? Zoroaster and Hermes Trismegistus, okay? And they believed that there were some Christian aspects of it, right? That there was kind of universal, and that they would have, and there was, exactly what it was, everybody kind of had their different flavor on exactly what the ancient religion would contain, but they believed that there was, kind of Christian elements of it, okay? But that it had gone back to great ancient sages, and you could find it all through all these ancient religions. And then what they meant was, kind of Mediterranean world, right? The Greeks and the Egyptians and Babylonians, and they weren't talking about the whole world. They were kind of talking about the old world, right? And this was an idea that esotericists were really, really like. Orthodox Protestants hated it. They believed that this was a terrible thing that absolutely corrupted everything. And the belief was that the ultimate locus of this ancient religion was Plato, even though Plato wasn't that ancient, but they believed that he was the great compiler of the ancient religion, and so that the ancient religion was very, very similar to Platonism. And again, modern scholars have often kind of bastardized Plato in saying he's not all that religious. That's completely false. Plato definitely is. And so I think people, the esotericists who are aware of this, and Joseph Smith as well, would have been aware of, Plato's fundamentally religious, right? Anyway, but there was these debates over this, right? The bottom line is kind of like, is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? You have the esotericists who were like, yes, this is great because there's truth everywhere and it's wonderful. You have Orthodox Protestants who are like, no, this is terrible. Sola scriptura. We don't want to be corrupted by all this extra thought. Now, Joseph Smith is, again, total rejection of that Protestant view, and total embrace of the more esoteric view, right? And he would have had access to this because this is in a lot of books. So, for instance, just any of the really important scholarly books. One of the real classics is Mosheim's Ecclesiastical History. Just rants and raves about the horrors of the ancient religion and how it had corrupted Christianity and how good Christians needed to fix Christianity and purge it, right? Joseph Smith owned this book, and as I talked about in my last presentation, he therefore could have had access to lots of descriptions of the ancient religion in these Orthodox people's denunciations, okay? And so again, look at my other presentation where I talk a little bit more about that, right? And one of the questions I addressed in that previous paper was, again, not believing the Book of Mormon is historical, But believing that Joseph Smith probably did, and I know that might seem a little bit contradictory, and I go over that in the other paper a little bit. But one of the things he seems to believe is that yes, there really were these Nephites, and that yes, they really did have this ancient religion. And again, being a specific thing that basically meant Platonism, right? And so that was kind of my question, like why would Joseph Smith believe that? Now, again, that might be a bit of a strange question for me to ask, and I go through that. I go through all that again, more in my other paper. But the summary that I give is that there was a scholarship that was out there on early American civilizations, right? Particularly, I believe these heavily influenced by a scholarship that was done on Mexico, pre-Columbians in Mexico and Peru, right? And that one of his main sources is the encyclopedia. This would be the third edition of the Encyclopedia Britannica. And the way they describe Peruvian religion, right, prior to, the Incas, right, prior to colonization, had all these Greek similarities, right? So there was this mythical figure or legendary figure named Manco Capac, who apparently gave them the religion. And he told them the Peruvians were taught by Manco to adore the creator of heaven and earth, that intelligence which animated the world. Now, referring to God as intelligence is very, very common in the descriptions of Platonism that were available to Joseph Smith. Okay. And then it's also kind of interesting because we have kind of a similarity with Abraham 3, where God is more intelligent than they are. And then again, referring to all premortal beings as intelligences, that was also quite common in the sources on Platonism that Joseph Smith would have had access to, right? And then there were these other aspects that sound kind of Greek in that encyclopedia entry on Peru, right? So for one, it says they seldom offered sacrifices to God, but worshipped him with their hearts. Now, again, this is interesting because, of course, when Jesus comes, he tells them no more sacrifice, broken heart and a contrite spirit. It says that they built a temple to the unknown God, which again sounds rather similar to when Paul goes to the Athens, which is, a bunch of Greeks, and in 1723 talks about their statue to the unknown God, right? So this kind of suggests kind of Greek sounding, right? And one of the ones that really stands out to me is the way they describe their religion, which they say they have these religious leaders named amentas, or philosophers, right? Talking about philosophers who delivered moral precepts and likewise cultivated poetry. Comedies and tragedies composed by those bards were acted on their festival. Again, doing all this stuff sounds rather Greek. And so this is actually, again, I go into it in more detail in my other presentation, but this is where I really do believe that this prompts Joseph Smith to believe that there is this ancient civilization in the Americas that has this higher truth. And of course, the Incas are going to come after the Nephites, and I go through this in the other paper. But my argument is that I believe that Joseph Smith believes that there are like sort of these traces of earlier truth that have persisted among later native tribes, okay, or civilizations, etc. So that you kind of have this echo of the Nephites who had been here earlier. All right, and just to give you a little, one of the real major sources I look at in that other paper is a book by Alexander von Humboldt, who does a whole bunch of research on pre-Columbian Mexico and Peru, and lays out all these things I think really would have prompted Joseph Smith to believe, that there's Nephites, because he talks about these legends of white bearded men, and that there was actually a civilization of white bearded men prior to the Inca, he says. At least he hears that there's these legends about it. And one of the things I actually think is interesting about the Proulx connection, because it's sort of the question I have, the Nephites take the long route to, if we see them sailing from Arabia, Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, landing on the west coast of, we have the statement from recorded of landing in Chile, but it's often assumed, wherever he landed, it's on the west coast. Well, that's the long route. If you're heading across Pacific, it's literally twice the distance to go that way. To go east, right, from Arabia is twice the distance. than it would be to sail through the Mediterranean to the, if you just needed to get to the Americas, right? Why not sail west rather than east? Because it's a lot closer, like Columbus does, right? Do the faster route, right? Even the, you got to sail through the Mediterranean, but still, that's not, there's a whole lot longer to go that long route that the Nephites take. And my argument is that it seems to be, in my opinion, my guess would be, Joseph Smith felt that where you had the more Nephite sounding civilization was Peru. And so landing on the West Coast was the good way to go, because that's where you get the Nephite sounding stuff, right? Anyway, not to get off on that. But another thing that Humboldt also brings up, and this actually is in the Mexico entry as well, is that there were legends, the Spanish record legends, that they believe sound like claims that there had been early civilizations that had come from the Tower of Babel, even though they don't use that term, but there had been a tower built to heaven, God had confounded the languages, and then their early civilizations had come from that tower. And he points out, the Spanish had said this, and both of these, the Mexico entry and Humboldt says, we don't really believe that the Indians were really saying these kinds of things. We think the Spanish priests were kind of embellishing this stuff. But it's interesting because, again, both of these sources do have that. Again, shows up in the Book of Mormon, which I do take it as, maybe even the scholars were doubtful of these stories. It would seem that Joseph Smith was not, because, again, this does work into the story. Okay. Now, I just want to give you a sense, because, again, my whole project is about listing out what I believe Joseph Smith's sources were and putting together the Book of Mormon. Again, not the non-biblical ones. I want to look at the things I would see as the distinctive Mormon ideas, not the not standard stuff that was more agreed upon. And I bring this up because Maxine had kind of wanted to know about this in my last presentation when we were talking later. So this is kind of a hierarchy of what I believe were the most important sources. So when I list these out number, it's the number of the most important. So number one would be the writings of Jane Lead, which I don't get into here or my other presentation, but I've given lots of presentations at conferences on Jane Lead, which I do argue is the most important one. Second would be Plato's writings. Yes, I do believe I encountered this. Yes, my sense is that probably was supported in this study by Josiah Stoll. So I do believe he encountered Plato, and that together, Plato and Lead make up, you can find over 90% of Mormonism's distinctive ideas in their writings. To a large extent, I know this may be a bold statement, that's kind of what Mormonism is, to a large extent. Now, I don't believe that was all he said, but those two are the real big kahunas. Now, I do think he's looking at a smattering of other things too. And so I do believe that there's what I would call tier 3, right? The third, so number 1, Lead, number 2, Plato, and then there's kind of a third tier. And I do believe there's probably tiers beneath the third tier, but the third tier, and that would include things like the Encyclopedia, which I had mentioned, that Moshine book I had mentioned, another book, Enfield. I believe he's using John Dee's Spirit Diary. And then another one, which I'm going to be talking more about, Andrew Michael Ramsey's The Travels of Cyrus. Okay. And so all of those, I think, really, really do kind of help flesh out Joseph Smith's ideas, even if the two main sources I argue are Lead and Plato. This third tier, I think, helps to kind of flesh things out and help him build a bit of what I would think of as a historical theology. In this third tier, I would say the importance would kind of go in that order. I would say the Encyclopedia would probably be the most important in the third tier. And so I'm going to be now talking more about Ramsey's Travels of Cyrus, which I also think is important. But in this third tier, it's probably the least important, but just to give you kind of a sense of rankings of the sources that I believe he's using. And then again, I believe there's tiers below it. There's always, we could go on and on and on and on about things that could have possibly influenced Joseph Smith. But this is kind of the hierarchy of, at least is what I'm arguing in my book, of what I think are the most essential. Okay. So this book, Andrew Michael Ramsey's book, The Travels of Cyrus, is really interesting. Andrew Michael Ramsey is one of these great esotericists. He fully embraces this notion of ancient religion, and he wants to write a book all about it, right? And it's a fictional book in which you have Cyrus, the king of Persia. He suffers a great tragedy when his love dies when he's a young man, and so he must go to seek wisdom, and he travels around the ancient world, talking to all the sages and discovering what's the meaning of everything. And that among them, he discovers like they all have these kinds of, they all tell him their mythology, and it's something that again Ramsey sort of makes up, based on some study. And they all have all these nations have kind of like this sort of trinity. I use that kind of loosely, but there's a high god the father and a high god the mother, and they have kind of a son, and the son's kind of a savior figure who's going to come to earth and preach good, the higher truth, right? And they all kind of have that, and his pre-existence is really important in every single one of these mythologies that he tells. That we all kind of fell from a pre-existent state, and this son figure, messianic kind of figure, will lead us back to God. And then he also really promotes everyone teaching universalism. That's a really big thing in Ramsey also. That eventually, there'll have to be several stages you go through, but everyone will go back to God. And so to give kind of a summary, Cyrus ends up at the very end. Of course, he's going to conquer all these areas and send the Jews back to Israel. But before he does that, he actually goes to Babylon and meets with Daniel, right? Daniel as in Daniel in the lion's den. And Daniel gives him like the Hebrew version, which is again a little bit manufactured. But Daniel tells him these principles, the traces of which are to be found in all religions, right? This is the idea of ancient religion, right? That this truth was spread everywhere, have been transmitted from age to age, from the deluge. Is where Ramsey traces this back, goes back to Noah. But in passing from mouth to mouth, they have been altered and obscured, so that there's this fundamental truth that goes back to Noah, and you can find it in all religions, but it kind of gets obscured, and you have to kind of have the true spiritual eyes in order to see, right? And that he kind of ends the narrative about Cyrus by saying the Prince of Persia, right? This is Cyrus, was struck by this discourse and wavered in his thoughts. He perceived that all the discoveries made by Zoroaster, right, these great sages of the ancient world, Hermes, Orpheus, Pythagoras, were but imperfect traces and chance rays of the tradition from Noah, right? Now, this would be Ramsey's version, right? Everyone would kind of argue exactly where does it go back to. For Ramsey, he argues for a religion of Noah, and it goes back to Noah and that kind of thing, right? But he's definitely drawing on this notion of, again, and as he even uses this term, ancient religion, that there's this fundamental thing that had gone back to all nations. And again, lots and lots of these doctrines are Platonic, right? And Ramsey even quotes lots and lots of Plato's passages, right? In the belief that Plato had these many aspects of the ancient religion, okay? All right. And there's a lot of Mormon ideas, right? In Ramsey's, so lots of things on preexistence, right? And one of the things, an interesting term is that Ramsey's over and over refers to pre-existent beings as intelligences. It's very, very common. This is a very popular book. It was in the local library, Manchester, being right next to Palmyra, right? They had a copy. It's very popular. I do think he used it, right? And I do think that he maybe, he didn't necessarily adopt every idea that was in it. But I do think he used the Travels of Cyrus. Okay. Now, one of the things that's interesting is that one of the myths that Ramsey lays out, right? Because he goes around to all these nations, and they all tell him their fundamental mythology. And again, it's definitely something that Ramsey has constructed. But he talks about a myth in one of these ancient worlds where the high god is Belus. And the interesting thing about saying that is because Humboldt does something interesting, right? Now, again, this is Humboldt who does all this research in his book on pre-Columbian civilizations, right? So coming back to Humboldt, does all this stuff. Humboldt does all this comparison between native religions, right? In Latin America, the Aztecs and the Incas and all these other civilizations that are in South and Central America. He does all these. He really wants to figure out where they're coming from, so he does all these comparisons, right? He has hundreds of pages on just on their zodiac. It's kind of interesting. But one of the things he does is, like many people have been interested in, is this notion of what's up with the pyramids, right? And he's got that too. So a lot of people compare him to Egyptian, and he does that a little bit. But one of the things he's really struck by is he believes that Aztec pyramids, their religious purpose and all this kind of stuff, he compares to actually Babylonian pyramids, in which he links to pyramids to Belus, right? So just as Ramsay is going to talk about a mythology about Belus, Humboldt makes his comparison, right, to Babylonians and Belus, right? And Humboldt is also going to give that myth, right, of the story of coming from the Tower of Babel, which is again in Babylon. So now we're making these links, right? Babylon, Jaredites, right? You're going to come from that, right? And one of the things also I find is kind of interesting, right, is Ramsay says, this is, the ultimate source of this religion of Noah. If you go to Genesis, as soon as you wrap up the Noah story, right, next chapter, I think it's maybe chapter 9, you move right into the Tower of Babel. So this would be very, very close to this Noah time when you have the Jaredites, right? They would be linking back, right? Again, my sense is all this stuff starts to link together. Now, what's interesting is, again, Ramses is going to give his own myth of this god Belus, right? And it's, again, they usually have a trinity, right? Being three gods. You have the high god, that's Belus, and he's got a consort, Urania, and they have their sun god, Adonis, okay? And in his story, he's mixing together these interesting themes, and he mixes things kind of like I argue Mormonism does, which is you have elements of their story that are kind of like the fall, right? The Genesis fall, where you have Adam and Eve, right? Because Urania is going to fall, right? She's going to rebel and fall. So it's kind of like Eve falling, but it's from a pre-existent state, right? They're not in the garden; they're up in heaven, and she's going to fall to earth through a rebellion. And this is a theme that's in a lot of Ramses myths, right? And in doing so, it's a lot like some stories that you find in Plato, particularly in his Phaedrus, right? Because in the Phaedrus, Plato talks about how souls, we were up in heaven and then we fall to earth, right? So you definitely see this, but he kind of frames it kind of like Adam and Eve, because Adonis is kind of like Adam, whereas when Urania falls, he kind of goes with her to kind of fall with her, right? And and then she kind of falls through the cosmos. So she actually first falls to the moon, and she's there for a while before she rebels some more, and then falls to Earth, right? So it's like this whole cosmic kind of thing, right? But it does have these Genesis themes of the fall as well, because you have the rebellious woman falling, right? And as she does so, she also brings her pre-mortal spirit beings, right? The children. She produces all the children, so she's like Heavenly Mother. But she also, as she falls, these pre-mortal beings fall with her. Okay, and then Adonis is kind of like Adam going with her, but he's also kind of like Jesus, because he does so in kind of this redemptive way, so that he eventually is able to preach to them all the truth, and so that they can it's a long, painful process, but they're going to overcome their fall and eventually return. And that's the myth, right? One of the things that's also interesting about this is, let's go back to Humboldt, right? So I'm jumping around, right? So let's go back to Humboldt, who's laying out all these legends that he says you find in the ancient Americas, okay? So Humboldt is very interested in these legends about these white-bearded men that bring civilization. One's Quetzalcoatl, right? And that's in Mexico. One is Manco Capac, that's in Peru. But then there's one who goes to Bogota, kind of in between Peru and Mexico, right? And what I point out in the other presentation is that this Bochica, right? He's the white-bearded man who goes to Bogota. He has some of these characteristics that kind of sound like Mosiah too. And so my sense is that I kind of thought that perhaps Joseph Smith would have thought of Bogota maybe being the location for Zarahemla, because we have Mosiah 2, right? We have this Bochica sort of acting like Mosiah 2, because he separates church and state, and he calls two different chiefs, and you have this chief judge, yada, yada, yada. Sorry, I see my other presentation going into that. But one of the things that's interesting is that Bochica has an evil wife who's tormenting the people, and so he has to just, cast her out, and he casts her out to the moon. And so what's one of the things I think is kind of interesting is that here you have Ramses with a Belus myth. And again, Humboldt says that he thinks that, this Babylonian Belus connection, because he's comparing these temples, right? And here you have Ramsay telling this Belus myth of Urania, the wife who becomes rebellious and actually falls to the moon. Then you get a myth from Humboldt of Bochica's wife being driven to the moon. And that does make me kind of wonder, is Joseph Smith perhaps because I do think he looks at both of these texts, is he then thinking, oh, well, there's reason to believe that this kind of mythology is coming from the Babylonians, and that this is actually an aspect of the ancient religion. Because again, this is how Ramses presents it. It comes from Noah, right? Right after Noah is when you get the Tower of Babel. And there's the legends, right? Humboldt says there's a legend that these people came from the Tower of Babel. Humboldt says don't take that too seriously, but I think that Joseph Smith probably did, right? And so again, linking all these things together. So again, coming from Babel, which is what Humboldt says. Humboldt links the Aztec temple with Belus temples in Babylon, right? And then he then tells this story about Bochica driving his wife to the moon, which also sounds a bit like Ramses' myth of Urania falling to the moon, right? All these things are kind of intersecting, which I think is interesting. Now, one of the things I think is really... Yes.
I'm sorry to break in. We're over time quite a bit.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was wondering if you feel like you're at a point where you could either take questions or kind of move to the punchline, just because we wanted to keep, I mean, we can go a little bit over, but
I didn't sorry about that, Trevor.
No, it's okay. I mean, this is a lot of great stuff, and maybe we could circle back if you don't feel like you're far enough along.
Well, let me see how many slides I got. I got like 4 slides left.
Okay.
Here's the punchline.
Okay.
Right? Here's the punchline. Alma, in 2 places, uses a line from the Belus myth that Ramsey gives, right? About the plan of salvation being frustrated. Okay. So Alma uses a similar line. Okay. And this line then shows up in, again, a couple of Alma lines, and even shows up in DNC 3.1, excuse me. Okay. There's lots to talk about there, of course. And Alma uses it in this plan of salvation of fallen redemption, which is what the Belus myth is about. Urania falls and is redeemed. Okay. Then, because he mentions it in Alma 13, excuse me. Alma 13 then launches into Alma's speech about the pre-existence, which is a little bit cryptic, of course, but he does talk about, hey, if you make good choices in the pre-existence, you can become the order of Melchizedek. This is very interesting stuff, I think, because it also lines up a lot with what Plato says in the Phaedrus about the pre-existence, yada, yada, yada. And then what I think is really interesting is the fact that Alma, when he's talking to Helaman, gives him a whole speech on how you're going to use the Jaredite records. Alma knows of the Jaredite records, and he even gives his 2 sons, Shiblon and Corianton, Jaredite names. All to say, was there the notion that Alma had been influenced by Jaredite religion, i.e. this Belus myth, because the Belus myth seems to work its way into Alma's speeches. The end. All right.
Well, thank you. This
Sorry
is
about
magnificent. No. I wish we had a lot longer. But in fairness to our other speakers, now I think if you don't mind, guys, what I'll do is, if you have questions for Stephen, if we could take those later on, if in case we need to wait for our final speaker, Gabriel, who said he might be a little bit late. So maybe if we hold off on the questions until then. I'm sure you have questions. I know you do. I'm sorry to cut to our next speaker, but I'm going to exercise a little discipline on myself and do that. And so let's a round of virtual applause to Stephen Fleming for wonderful talk. Certainly every time you present something, I wish we could spend a day on it, because there's so much wonderful stuff there. So thank you, Stephen. Now we're going to move to our second speaker, Dr. Nicholas S. Literski, JD, PhD, and adjunct senior lecturer in psychology at the California Institute of Integral Studies. A professional spiritual guide. He holds a doctorate in depth psychology with an emphasis in Jungian and archetypal studies from Pacifica Graduate Institute, as well as a master's in spiritual guidance from Sophia University. They're excuse me, I'm misgendering, and you'll have to please excuse me for that, Nick. That was really unforgivable. But their research interests include depth psychological reflections on spirituality, ceremonial magic, Paleolithic cave art, sexual orientation, and gender identity. Nick's work has been published in multiple professional journals. Their recent book, Method Infinite, Freemasonry and the Mormon Restoration, was published by Greg Cofford Books in 2022. Paper today, I'm excited they're giving their talk on this fantastic topic, a practitioner's perspective on the Smith family Holiness to the Lord Parchment. And what I understand, there's going to be a response to other recent discussions of this text. So I'm really looking forward to that. Let's welcome Dr. Nick Literski.
Thank you. Okay, Trevor, if you would allow screen sharing, please.
Will do.
Thank you. Right. So historian Tabitha Stanmore observed that in one form or another, magic is constant in all societies across the world and throughout time. The fact of its existence is never a novelty. As Dr. D. Michael Quinn and others have demonstrated, magic is unquestionably present within the Mormon past. Rather than fearing magic as somehow at odds with the religious claims of Joseph Smith Jr. and his family, we should consider it as one of the many lenses by which we can better understand the Mormon restoration writ large. The Holiness of the Lord Parchment, passed down through the descendants of Hiram Smith, is an important vehicle to this understanding. After LDS Patriarch Eldred G. Smith began to publicly exhibit the Smith family's 3 magical parchments in 1979, they soon began to attract study. Initially, they were believed to be Masonic in nature, an assumption refuted by Arturo de Hoyos, the Grand Archivist of the southern jurisdiction of the Scottish Rite. A more thorough analysis appeared 5 years later. In Quinn's Early Mormonism and the Magic Worldview, Quinn and his successors have added to our understanding, primarily by finding parallels in various historical documents, but they've also suffered from a lack of context. Just as the intersection of Freemasonry and Mormonism was occluded for many years due to researchers who were only familiar with one tradition or the other, scholarship on the Smith family parchment has lacked this perspective of practicing ceremonial magicians. When Quinn's work was first published, I was inspired to seek out some of the primary sources, including magical grimoires. I found the material intriguing, but also vague, confusing, overwhelming. Years later, after gaining my own experience as a practicing magician, these books suddenly emerge as if from a dense fog. I soon realized that they are written by practitioners for practitioners, assuming a level of context and experience that outsiders would never fully grasp. My intention today is to bring this experience to the Smith family Holiness to the Lord Parchment. Unlike the other 2 charms handed down with it, the Holiness to the Lord Parchment is more properly referred to as a lamen. So what is a lamen? Well, a lamen, not to be confused with nor pronounced like layman in the Book of Mormon, is a sacred image or chart typically made on metal, but perfumed or wax tablets, or pure white paper with convenient colors, and used for the purpose of ritually invoking one or more spirits. The elements and arrangements of the Smith family lamen demonstrate, as I'll explain, that it was carefully constructed to invoke a good spirit and protect the wearer from temptations. And the classic source for describing the construction of a lamen is Pseudo-Agrippa's 1559 fourth book of philosophy. But much of Pseudo-Agrippa's work was directly reproduced in 1801 by Francis Barrett in the Magus. Copies of the Magus made their way around the world, including the United States, where it provided the template for Joseph Smith's Jupiter talisman. As noted by Quinn and others, a direct connection to the Smith family can be drawn here and is established by the fact that the Jupiter talisman produced a very specific printing error from the Magus. According to the Magus, a lamen may be square, circular, or triangular, or of the like sort. In its center, the magician should draw a six-cornered figure containing the name of either a star or a governing spirit who holds authority over the spirit the magician wishes to invoke. In the outer corners of the lamen, the magician should draw a minimum of 4 pentagrams or more, depending on the number of spirits being invoked. Additional details of the lamen would depend on the particular nature of these spirits. Various images called seals or pentacles were a vital part of the lamen, to the point that the magicians frequently referred to their lamens as sacred pentacles. According to the Magus, these pentacles are certain holy signs and characters, preserving us from evil chances and events, helping and assisting us to bind, exterminate, and drive away evil spirits, alluring good spirits, and reconciling them to us. These pentacles consist of either characters of good spirits of the superior order, or of sacred pictures of holy letters or revelations, with apt and proper versicles, which are composed either of geometrical figures and holy names of God, according to the course and manner of the many of them, or they are compounded of all of them, or many of them mixed. As a general matter, these images were to be surrounded by a double border containing the name of the angel, one or more divine names, or a scriptural reference related to the lamen's desired effects. The Smith family lamen follows these basic conditions, beginning with various protective pentacles or seals. First, it contains a talisman that was readily available in the popular 1825 book, The Astrologer of the 19th Century by Robert Cross Smith, writing under the pseudonym of Raphael. This talisman promised that he that beareth this sign about him shall be helped in every need and necessity. Second, the lamen contained a seal of the earth from Ebenezer Sibley's 1790 new and complete illustration of the celestial sciences, promising that whosoever beareth this sign need fear no foe. Third, the lamen included a polygonal figure which contained the great character and the greatest character illustrated by Sibley. The Smith version contained the divine names tetragrammaton, made up of syllables written in the external points of the figure, and Adonai written in the center. Fourth, the Smith family included sigils from the Sibleys representing the angel Polypa and Nalga, both of which were intended to uplift the mind of the wearer and protect them against various threats posed by evil spirits, such as witchcraft and sexual temptations. Next, the double border of the Smith family lamen contained 2 key elements. First, a versicle or short biblical passage of importance was written 3 times, as in the case, Holiness of the Lord. Second, the tetragrammaton motif was written in the form of its standard 4 Hebrew letters, Yod He Vav He, repeated 3 times across the bottom. This border, with its scriptural references and divine names, served as a container and bound for the lamen, much like a magic circle. The lamen also contained elements designed to attract good spirits, which the magician wished to conjure. Another seal, also from Sibley, promised that whosoever beareth this seal, all spirits shall do him homage. At the center of the lamen was a 12-pointed star, an innovation from the 6-pointed star specified in the Magus, containing the name Raphael. This would indicate that the Smith family lamen was specifically intended to invoke a spirit that was subject to the governance of the archangel Raphael. Segments of the Raphael star contained additional spirit and divine names written in Hebrew. Notably, every one of these names appeared in a chart of planetary correspondences within the Magus. The Smith family lamen was intricately constructed using standard magical books of the time for the purpose of guarding against evil spirits and invoking a good spirit. Its alignment with spirit invocation practices of the time set it apart as from the 2 other Smith parchments, which were just mere charms. The perspective of a practicing ceremonial magician, therefore, clarifies aspects of the lamen which have not previously been well understood. So, astrology or something else going on here? While the Smith family lamen was dominated by powerful magical symbols, a careful examination shows more subtle details. For example, all of the symbols of the zodiac and the known planets were present. The immediate temptation is to assume this arrangement is a nativity chart, reflecting the positions of the planets at the time of a significant birth or a momentous event. If this was true, we could reverse engineer the date referred to in the Laman by starting with the positions of the outer planets. In this case, Saturn appears opposite of Uranus. Uranus is in Cancer, while Saturn is in Sagittarius. Within the decades surrounding the Mormon Restoration, these conditions were only met between July 13th, 1781 and January 12th of 1782. This rules out reference to any event, since we think of the Restoration beginning with Joseph Smith's 1820 religious pondering. The range does, however, fit the birth date of a figure related to Mormonism's founding. John Smith, uncle of Joseph Smith, was born on July 16, 1781, just 3 days into the required alignment. Now, these implications would be intriguing, possibly even requiring a revision to the Laman's traditional provenance. The Laman was allegedly preserved by Mary Fielding Smith, the wife of Hiram Smith, who passed it on to their son John Smith, and thence down through the Latter-day Saint patriarchal office. Before young John Smith came of age, however, Uncle John Smith served as LDS Church Patriarch. If the Smith family Laman contains a nativity chart for Uncle John Smith, then it would likely have originated with him rather than with Hiram. As an alternate possibility, the Laman could portray a horary chart. When a client brought a question to an astrologer, the latter would take a note of the exact time and cast a chart for that precise moment. Based on the positions of the planet and the zodiac signs, the astrologer would then provide a divinatory answer. If the Laman portrayed a horary chart, it would have been in the last half of 1781 or the beginning days of 1782, making it completely unrelated to the Mormon Restoration. There are, however, serious problems with both of these hypotheses. Neither a nativity chart nor a horary chart would include a double representation of Saturn, as we see here and here, as the Smith family Laman does this. Now, nor would they include a double representation of Aries, which also appears in the Laman. Either chart form would have included Mercury as well, which is missing from the Laman. The horary chart is especially ruled out since the 1781 to 1782 timeframe predates the 1784 publication of Ebenezer Sibley's new and complete illustration of celestial sciences, from which other features of the Laman were directly copied. In short, the internal evidence proves that the Smith family Laman did not contain a nativity chart or a horary chart. Even if the Smith family Laman did reflect such a chart, it would be impossible to determine its true significance. Placing my isolation of the planet and zodiac figures side by side with the full Laman shows that the planets and zodiac figures were added to the Laman after the major magical figures were drawn. They just squeezed them in, fit as close to their intended location as possible, but within the constraints of the remaining open space. This destroys any possibility of calculating a precise date. Another explanation must exist for the inclusion of these figures. Working again from my isolation of the planetary and zodiac figures, I indicated which house, i.e., which triangular segment of zodiac these each fell into. The magician seems to have tried to redraw Aries closer to its own house. More importantly, the magician drew the figure for Saturn within 2 different houses. The answer to this mystery lies in the centuries-old practice of geomancy, which derives from geo, meaning earth, and mancy, meaning a system of divination. Geomancy, which had its roots in 7th century Islam, began with tossing sticks or stones to create random holes in the sand, but later shifted toward more casting lots. Works such as the 4th book of occult philosophy, John Hayden's 1664 Theomagicai, and Robert Cross Smith's 1825 Astrologer of the 19th Century instructed astrologers and magicians on this system. Geomantic castings created a set of random figures matching 16 recognized patterns. By one popular method, each of the 16 patterns was attributed to particular planets. The resulting planets were then arranged in the houses of a traditional astrological chart, allowing the magician to obtain insight regarding specific influences of the client's question. Astrological geomancy was thus a poor man's astrology, freed from the need to make complicated mathematical calculations. The geomantic house chart fulfilled all of the same functions as a horary chart, allowing the magician a method to answer their client's immediate questions. Notably, the process for creating a geomantic house chart allowed for planets to appear in more than one house. In fact, planets inevitably appeared in more than one geomantic chart, since there were more houses than there were geomantic figures, or than the planets at the time, rather. At the time, a planet could be entirely absent, its geomantic figure not having appeared in the casting of lots. As with the astronomical horary chart, the casting of a geomantic house chart seeks divination to a specific question. It's not possible to reverse engineer what the question was, given the squeezed-in position of the planets on the Smith family lawman. Some of their positions cannot be precisely determined to begin with. That said, the inclusion of a divinatory geomantic chart on the Smith lawman would suggest that the question had something to do with the purpose for which the lawman was created, that being the invocation of a spirit. Whatever the original question, the magician must have believed that the divinatory response was not only positive, but somehow enhancing the lawman's power. Mysterious characters. A final mystery has plagued those attempting to understand the Smith family lawman. Within the double border of the lawman on three sides, the magician repeated a string of characters that have never been deciphered. Quinn was unable to find a source for these characters, speculating they contained a substitution code for an unknown name. Based on the use of specialized alphabets to encode magical names in the Magus and elsewhere, this was not an unreasonable assumption. Others have proceeded on this same substitution code hypothesis, including Dan Vogel recently, who consulted with Joseph H. Peterson, a respected scholar of magical history and grimoires, to no avail. Having a somewhat larger network of academics and other specialists in the field of magical practice and history, I also contained several of my own expert contacts, none of which were able to decipher the inscription. One challenge with the substitution code hypothesis is that the number of characters in the inscription cannot be determined with any certainty. Quinn discerned 9 separate characters, while Vogel believed there were only 7. In my original investigation of the inscription, I too assumed a substitution code was used. One character, for example, closely resembles the Greek letter epsilon, which seems to encourage the substitution code hypothesis. In searching the Magus, I found 2 figures which resembled the I-shaped figure and the sideways S-shaped figure in the inscription. These, however, were simple descriptors for good spirits, representing perpendicular and separate. Consulting Fred Getting's exhaustive Dictionary of Occult, Hermetic, and Alchemical Sigils, I found the character somewhat resembling a Jupiter symbol appeared as a signifier for steel in a 1701 lexicon, in a 13th century document, which would not likely have been available. I also searched Edmund Fry's Pantographia, a commonly available 1799 work containing over 200 then known alphabets, and found only limited resemblance to a few random letters. Based on my various attempts, I am convinced that these mysterious characters do not represent a simple substitution code. Dan Vogel recently announced his own speculation that the inscription consists of 7 characters, each representing one of the Chaldean planets. This approach has some merit, given that one character resembles the moon and another resembles a modern Jupiter symbol. Vogel's theory, which he was careful to qualify as pure conjecture, posited that the inscription was derived from a string of planetary symbols in a 1750 chapbook, the High German Fortune Teller. As Vogel demonstrated, these symbols varied considerably in subsequent other publications through 1827. While Vogel deserves praise for his deep research and innovative approach, there are problems with this hypothesis. First, the High German fortune teller characters are portrayed as part of a common charm to force a thief to return stolen goods. The text of this charm is important. Put down the minute when the goods were stolen and the planet ruling the day. So this done, put down the following characters on a fair piece of parchment. So turn around thrice, and if you hear no news of the thief in 24 hours, as 10 to 1 you will, prick the parchment full of holes and hang it up the chimney, where the heat of the fire may a little scorch it, and the thief will be so restless he will bring back the goods. The Smith lawman, as explained earlier, does not reliably specify an exact date, let alone a minute. Further, the Smith lawman is far more complex in its construction than the simple charm from the High German fortune teller. Vogel could argue that the magicians who constructed the Smith-Laman adapted characters at random, without regard for their context of thievery. This, however, would be at odds with the Laman's otherwise careful and clearly intentional design. My own research and experience convinces me that nothing in the Smith-Laman was random. I believe that a more useful approach would be to consider this inscription within the context of its usage. Researchers might derive good direction from the title of Vogel's presentation video, Joseph Smith the Necromancer. Interestingly, Joseph Smith's uncle Jesse Smith discussed his nephew in 1829 and accused him of obtaining the golden plates by necromancy, only later claiming that an angel had revealed the location with a promise of great wealth, gold and silver, and precious stones that he would have dominion over all the land of Palmyra. Necromancy stems from necro meaning dead and mancy meaning divination, hence divination by means of the dead. And notwithstanding lurid tales of raising corpses from the grave, the vast majority of necromancy involved invoking the shades or spirits of the dead in order to obtain information. While some of the detailed rituals of necromancy differed between various sources, the wearing of a laman has been a consistent part of the ceremony. The laman contains images intended to protect the wearer from the potential risks of necromancy. Nibley wrote that while a magician could certainly call forth spirits of the dead and bind them without any evil influences, safeguards were called for. Too often, he suggested, an officious attitude could lead the magician to enter into unholy contracts. This helps to explain why the Smith family laman is predominantly filled with protective elements. The laman's elements to attract and invoke a spirit, on the other hand, seem to be relatively few at first glance. The border, with its versicle and band, of divine names, served its double purpose as we already described. The Nibley seal was included, causing all spirits to pay homage to the magician. The pentagram was drawn in each corner. The central star was added, which according to the Magus should contain the name and character of the star or of the spirit his governor, to whom this good spirit that is called is subject. This latter figure, understood properly, might be good-naturedly thought of as the magician's version of being a Karen, calling the manager in order to obtain desired services from subordinates. Good measure, the magician added multiple angelic and divine names to this latter figure, drawing again on authority to command a target spirit. The observant viewer might notice by now that every element of the Smith family laman thus far relies upon just three sources. Francis Barrett's The Magus, published in 1801, Ebenezer Sibley's New and Complete Illustration of the Celestial Sciences, published in multiple editions beginning in 1884, and Robert Cross Smith's Astrologer of the 19th Century, published in 1825. These are all from my own collection. All three of these volumes, as noted by Quinn, were available in the New England of Joseph Smith's time. Even the most rare of these, the Magus, has already been firmly established as an influence on Joseph Smith. This suggests that if we look primarily to these sources in order to understand the thrice-repeated mysterious characters of the Smith family laman. Francis Barrett included a small section of the Magus, which was allegedly constructed and composed by Johannes Trithemius, a Benedictine abbot and occultist whose lifespan bridged the 15th and 16th centuries in Germany. This section of the Magus added condensed specific instructions on how to conjure spirits to visible appearance. With regard to the use of a laman in this ritual, Trithemius directed the aspiring magician to hang the pentacle around thy neck. For added clarity, Trithemius provided helpful drawings of each tool used in the conjuration, including the pentacle or laman. This example provided the same basic requirements as described elsewhere in the Magus. The laman is intended here to aid the magician in conjuring Michael the archangel, who as an archangel had no other superior spirits to call upon his influence. First, Michael's name is done in both English and in Hebrew. Finally, the center of the star contains the sigil of Michael. A spirit's name or sigil was typically written 3 times in any laman intended to summon them. Each time it was written in a different language or alphabet, the latter of which the Magus helpfully provided several. The sigil, however, was something different and special. The sigil was a figurative drawing unique to every spirit. One might readily notice that the sigil has no relationship to known human languages, but rather seems like an almost random shape and appearance. It cannot be translated, nor is it a substitution code. For certain well-established spirits who had a long history of working with magicians, sigils were known and provided in books such as the Magus. Knowing a spirit's true name as reflected in their sigil was a key to obtaining that spirit's cooperation in the future. For other spirits, however, such as spirits of the dead that one might conjure in an act of necromancy, it was up to the magician to obtain a sigil directly from the spirit in question. Once this was obtained through a pact with the spirit, the magician had the option of calling upon that spirit at future times with a much abbreviated ritual. Looking back on the Smith Lawman, the only name written in English is Raphael, whose name is also written in Hebrew. The sigil of Raphael, however, is absent, despite being readily available in the Magus and other works. Therefore, the magician clearly regarded Raphael as a superior to some other spirit who was the intended target of this lawman. Based on magical texts which form the source of the Smith Lawman, and with the practical view of a magician using those texts, there's only one reasonable explanation for the thrice repeated mysterious characters. The magician who constructed the Smith family lawman intended to summon a spirit with whom they had already communicated, a spirit who had provided their sigil and agreed to return to the magician when called upon by this in the future. I wish to be cautious in attempting to identify this spirit. The lawman was evidently in the possession of Hiram Smith when he and Joseph Smith were murdered, and it was passed down through his descendants. That said, it was Joseph Smith Jr. who told of interactions with multiple spiritual messengers. It was Joseph who died with a Jupiter talisman on his person, copied directly from the Magus. Joseph's connections with the spirit of conjuring treasure guardian spirits are well documented. I'm not particularly disposed to believe Joseph's religious claims. The specific details of his encounters with Moroni, however, suggest to me, as a practitioner of ceremonial magic, that his story should not be dismissed as mere fancy. Disregarded by many, the Smith family may well, in fact, be the earliest known artifact uniquely and exclusively tied with Mormonism. In this precious artifact, carefully handed down through the Smith family, I suspect that we see the sigil of the spirit Joseph called upon as he made his yearly visits to Cumorah. In offering this research, I see in my mind's eye my brother magician on the night of the fall equinox in 1827. He knows the rites of necromancy by which a man can commune with angels, demons, and the spirits of the dead. Perhaps he's fasted a few days and washed himself. As his father later told Willard Chase, he dressed himself with great care and solemnity in a suit of black clothing, and fit out a black horse he had borrowed from a friend. Reaching the hill, he climbs in silence. He once again reaches the spot he knows so well, and quietly uses his sword or dagger to draw a circle on the ground with sacred names and images. Following the old magical books, he hangs a leather pouch around his neck, containing a lawman that has been carefully drawn and properly consecrated. He stands within the circle, declaring authority in the divine names of Adonai and Tetragrammaton. He calls forth the spirit whose sigil adorns his lawman, and demands custody of the treasure, a book engraved on gold plates. Successful in his quest, he takes the treasure and quickly descends the hill, being careful not to look back at the burial space. What happened beyond that, only my brother Joseph knows for sure. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Will you entertain questions? We have time
Absolutely.
for a couple, I think. Thank you so much. We appreciate that.
Okay. I did not look at the chat while I was speaking, so.
Well done, Nick.
Thank you. Clinton asks, which spirits were governed by Raphael? Any spirits associated with the planet Mercury or with the god Mercury. There's not a definitive list in that sense. And in fact, any spirit that you conjured might reveal its nature as to what planetary influence or what spiritual influence governed it. So unfortunately, we can't just say, okay, it's Raphael, here's our directory.
So one of the things you suggest as a supposition, right, is that this could have been a sigil of Moroni. Is there any reason why Joseph might have thought that Moroni was ruled over by Raphael or anything like that? One of the questions I thought.
Well, Mercury is all about communication.
Hmm.
Mercury is related to Thoth, Odin, Hermes. Mercury is in particular a god of writing.
Mhm.
So that makes a rather interesting association for a book engraved on golden plates. Also, you can link this to the myths of Hermes Trismegistus, who engraved his knowledge on golden plates. So just off the top of my head, that we have those kind of associations.
Thank you, Nick.
Absolutely. Let's see. Just checking out here what else is in the. Why would quadrant 12 be empty? Again, a good question. And again, it's because of the fact that they had already placed the major magical figures in the Laman. And then they took the astronomical and planetary figures and squeezed them in the blank spots wherever there was room for them. So many of them are not going to be exactly where they were in the reading. They're going to be as close as they could get them. Let's see.
I just asked a little question there toward the bottom about the possibility of any overlap with the characters document and that particular sigil.
I have also played with that, and there just isn't.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That was definitely one of my approaches, and yeah, it's just the idea of a substitution cipher simply does not play out.
Okay. So Nathan Hadfield is asking where the questions are being posted, and the answer is in chat. Nathan, would you like to ask a question? Okay, he says no. Does anyone else have a question? What you've done here in my mind is, it's just mind blowing. Because you are really, you have nailed this document in a way that everyone up to now has failed to do, and it's a very convincing argument. So I'm just really beside myself with excitement here. And I think your experience as a practitioner is absolutely crucial in reaching this perspective that so many other people who've come at this problem, very intelligent people, great scholars, but alas, they're not practitioners, and they wouldn't really know about the use of these documents, how they're actually used. It's a great liability for them. So is there anything you could tell us about approaching this as a practitioner just generally?
Sure. So as I mentioned toward the beginning of my paper, I began looking at grimoires, particularly the Magus, early on, like as soon as Quinn's book came out, and that came out in '89, the first version. And through that time, like from that time until now, I've almost always had a copy of the Magus. For a long time, it was the cheap $15 paperback reprint that you can order on Amazon. And I've gradually collected my way up to where I now have an original 1801, which are very rare. When I first tried to read the Magus and understand all these images and all these details in it, it was confusing. It was just impenetrable. And it wasn't until I actually began learning and practicing ceremonial magic with the help of other magicians and really tutoring, if you will, that I coming back to those documents, I was able to say, oh, this is really clear. Carl Jung had a similar experience, I found out later, because he did a great deal of work on alchemy. And he also said that when he first began looking at alchemical manuscripts, they were just a massive confusion to him. And it was only later, after he came to his own realizations of what's going on, that all of a sudden, they were suddenly an open book. You could relate that in some ways, honestly, to some things that Joseph said about the Book of Mormon itself, as far as things being made plain. So, for example, when you look at Quinn, and please don't take any disrespect for Quinn, because I think we all have huge regard for him and his work. But there are places that he can read the documents, and any historian can read the documents, but that doesn't mean they understand the context and the culture and the meaning of the documents. So there are places where Quinn was dead on correct. There are places where Quinn misunderstood what he was reading. And there are places where the same passages he's reading actually revealed much bigger things than he realized to include. Simply because of this lack of context. Similar thing, this is really similar to the work that Joe Steve Swick and Cheryl Bruno and I did on Method Infinite, coming to that as for the first time as scholars with experience in both Mormonism and Freemasonry, instead of with just one tradition or the other. We were able to see things and understand what we were looking at in the sources in a different way than historians without that experience had done in the past. So I'm trying to bring a practitioner's perspective, as I said, to open up the mystery.
Yeah.
Because here, this is something that is not going to be understood just by looking at a copy of the Magus without context.
Yeah.
But once you do understand what is being explained, this is what, the light bulb comes on. This is what the inscription has to be. It's the only logical thing in practical terms. If it's not a sigil of the spirit that the lawman is targeted at, then it is completely random scribbling, and that's out of character for anything else on the lawman.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you again. This was marvelous. I know that we have other questions in chat. If maybe you could answer those in chat as you have time. Once again, I'm really pushing forward. Another round of applause for a fantastic presentation. Thank you, Nick. Dr. Literski, it was fantastic. But moving along now, we want to introduce our third speaker, Brandon Wilson. Brandon is a PhD student in religious studies at Claremont Graduate University. He has a master's in religious studies from Rice University, where he wrote his thesis on Manly P. Hall. Wonderful. And the esoteric milieu he created in the greater Los Angeles area. I'm looking forward to reading that. His overarching research interests center on comparative esoteric metaphysics and praxis, and he is currently focusing his research on contemporary Latter-day Saint esoteric practice and Latter-day Saint reception of the ancient mysteries. Whew, I'm drooling now. He is also the co-host of the podcast The Analyst and the Fool, where he and his co-host Christian Van Dyke analyze important philosophical texts, explore the diversity of Latter-day Saint thought, and engage in further pseudo-intellectual shenanigans with, I would say, probably less emphasis on the pseudo than he's joking about. So without further ado, we'll turn the time over to Brandon, and I'm going to make you a co-host, Brandon.
Fantastic. I was just about to ask that.
All right, you're a co-host.
Fantastic. Let's jump into here. Get that out of the way. Hold on. There we go. All right, can everyone see this? Okay. I guess I can't see everyone's faces. So I'm going to be presenting on one of my spiritual heroes, who actually I'm in the field now because I decided to break missionary rules and read some of his books when I was a missionary in Fresno, California, back in 2012 through 2014. I want to talk about Hugh Nibley. And as I've put here in the title, it's primarily about Hugh Nibley, Hierophancy, and the Latter-day Saint use. I would even probably change that word use of reception of ancient mysteries. So just a little bit about Hugh Nibley as a person. His life is quite a ride, actually, when you really dive into what he went through in his lifetime. Um, he initially wanted to be a sociologist and graduated at UCLA with a master's degree, or with a bachelor's degree in sociology, and even started the master's program, but instead dropped out to go into ancient history. One of the reasons why he did that was because as he was interested in sociology because he was deeply, deeply political. Not just political in the broader sense, but he was also very polemical in his political drives. And he saw a lot of, he encountered the works of James Frazer and Edward Tyler and saw a lot of what they were articulating, particularly Frazer, with ancient worldviews that have perpetuated to that have perpetuated to the present day, but that needed to be snuffed out in favor of more progressive, more liberal, more scientific worldviews. And at the time that he was doing his research into ancient history, this was the worldview that this is what was driving him to study ancient history. It wasn't because of any love of ancient history, actually quite the contrary. He wanted to identify characteristics that were ancient, primitive, to use that word that was quite popular back in the early 1930s and 1920s when he was studying. And he wanted to try to push the United States and the world in general, but especially the United States, of snuffing out those really ancient worldviews and practices and try to move on to a liberal, more enlightened place to live. And interestingly, something that doesn't get brought up very often about Hugh Nibley's early life was that he had strong Nazi and Soviet sympathies. This was, of course, prior to World War II, when Nazi Germany was just starting their conquests of Europe. Nibley actually dated somebody when he was teaching at Claremont Graduate University. That's actually where he started prior to joining the armed forces. He dated a Nazi, a woman that had immigrated to the United States to teach at this university, to teach German and German literature, and she herself was a Nazi. So Nibley, but of course that changed, and those ideals shifted quite drastically when he decided to join the armed forces during World War II. He joined the Army, and he was in the 101st Airborne Division, and he led a Jeep on Utah Beach on D-Day. In fact, he was the second Jeep out, but the Jeep in front of him exploded. It got blew up by a bomb, and so he had to lead all the Jeeps onto the beach. And not only that, but he was also one of the first responders at Auschwitz. We don't exactly know how that impacted him outside. We just know that he was there because he mentioned it in a letter home to his family, that he went to Auschwitz and took care of business there. And so with a lot of this engagement in World War II, Nibley's politics shifts very dramatically. I mean, almost night and day difference. He doesn't have positive things to say about the United States and the political front there necessarily, but he, obviously no longer views Nazism and the Soviet Union as heralds of an enlightened and a liberal utopia anymore. He actually becomes quite pessimistic. So much so that he no longer thinks that the church was something that was worthy of being a part of. And during this point where he's rather dejected, actually, you know what? I'm off my timeline here, so I'll just say that he had a near-death experience that kept him in the church in 1939. But he nevertheless struggled with a lot of the church's politics, particularly as they were more right-leaning, and that was something that he's actually struggled with for most of his life, especially since he was teaching at BYU. However, when he finally got to BYU in the 1940s, he focused a lot on ancient philosophy and languages, but the church asked him to host a series on KSL called The World and the Prophets, which has since been compiled and has been published into a book twice. This particular moment marks a very strong shift in Nibley's attitudes towards ancient epistemologies, or what he would call the mantic worldviews, or the mantic worlds. Whereas he wrote a lot about the ancient world, most of which are even published in volume 10 of his collected works called The Ancient State. A lot of those works, such as the hierocentric state, tent tolling and taxing, and the arrow and the hunter, these recently have been compiled as if they were some sort of proto-temple theology in Nibley's history, but that's actually not the case at all. He was writing about these ancient political structures in a polemical way, not in a laudatory way, but later in his life, he would actually reverse course and use those documents as something a bit more praiseworthy. But after the church acquired the Joseph Smith papyri in 1969 and recruited him in the translation efforts of the text, that's when he starts opening up a bit more to the temple, particularly the Latter-day Saint temple, and what it is that it has to offer him. He had written quite a bit about it and was sympathetic towards it, but it was his involvement with the Joseph Smith papyri, that his obsession with the temple theology, and especially seeing Joseph Smith as a hierophant is really, really where it marks. But the main argument that I want to come away from this history is that Hugh Nibley, throughout his life, and especially after his death, he transforms into a hierophant. And I think that is something about his work that gets neglected, oftentimes because he was a teacher at BYU and he was a professor of ancient history and knew over 2 dozen languages. I think I capped him out at 26 when I actually counted all of it. But later in his life, he shifts away from scholarship and instead engages with ancient mysteries as a way of providing an esoteric exegesis of the Latter-day Saint temple practice and experiences. Where he, as you look at this quote that I've put here, that's from his book, Temple and Cosmos, he quotes the quotations that are in here, such as the mysteries of the truth are revealed as types and images, and that the veil conceals how God really governs in the physical creation. These are all quotations from the Gospel of Philip, which is a text that was found in Nag Hammadi and is generally associated with Valentinian Gnosticism and early Christianity. What's fascinating about Hugh's use of the mysteries, though, is that his previous attitudes that he had early in life, he maintained throughout his life, meaning that he viewed the ancient Gnostics or the ancient mysteries as more veiled illusions, or what's the word I'm looking for? Apostate. They were apostate copies of the real thing, and yet Joseph Smith had tapped into something that was more real and gave something that was a bit more real. And so, again, to restate my argument here, I think that Hugh Nibley gets misinterpreted as an apologist and especially as a scholar, when instead he's actually trying to instill and create sacred experiences for Latter-day Saints that participate in temple practices. And here's some further examples of what I'm calling his Mormonosis, or trying to instill a testimony, as it might be called within Mormonism, where he likens the Gospel of Philip, particularly its bride chamber ritual, or the bride chamber sacrament, as it's called, as the ultimate sacrament that leads to the creation of a divine hermaphrodite. So as I emphasize down here, recent findings indicate unusual emphasis placed on a perfect unity of the sexes in marriage ordinances, which were real enough and secret enough to excite the scandalized speculations of outsiders. And of course, he's referring to Irenaeus. But what's fascinating about this is that a person who is not a Latter-day Saint, or especially somebody who hasn't been initiated into the temple rites, might read this and not exactly understand, especially as he lumps all of these texts together. Like, he'll quote from the Gospel of Philip, then he'll quote the Enuma Elish, and then he'll quote the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and then he'll jump back to something to Kabbalah and alchemical texts, and he lumps all of these together as if they're all saying the same thing. And from an outsider's perspective, that seems quite strange. Why is he lumping all these disparate texts from different time periods, from different traditions and different milieus and cognitive structures and all that stuff? Why is he lumping them all together as if they're saying the same thing? But in the context of the temple ritual, or with the initiatories, or the washing and the anointings and the endowment process of being escorted through a cosmic history, a cosmic drama of the fall of man and their eventual, or the fall of humanity, the fall of Adam and Eve, and their eventual rise to deification. All of this makes perfect sense. And when you understand what it is that Nibley's trying to do when he's writing about these things, or presenting on them even. Okay. And so I want to kind of give Nibley his own voice here, because I can talk for him all day long. But as for those who are familiar with Nibley, Nibley's pretty good at talking for himself, and doing so rather in a verbose way. So I'm going to play a little clip here, let him talk, and just to kind of highlight what it is that I've been talking about here. Actually, before I stop getting into that, can all of you hear that? If you can, give me a thumbs up in the chat.
I can't hear it.
Okay, let me do something real quick. I think I forgot to share. I think I forgot to share my sound here.
Okay.
Yep, that's exactly what I did. All right, let's try that again.
And then just the tongue down here is complete. So he's physically reinstated. Everything is gone. The positivism of modern science has obsessed us with this idea that the Egyptians are beset with this morbid preoccupation with death, the gloom, and the tomb. The grisly mummy image, that we've got with the Egyptians, and nothing could be farther from the truth. Resurrection, not death, is the theme here. Look at this man. He's striding forth with purpose and gladness, his eyes looking forward. The hands above his head are raised in the Ka gesture, which is the salute to the spirit moving into the higher world. The upper world is the Ka, you see. When you enter the presence of a great one, you raise both hands to show that you're not armed. Also, that you bear no ill will, and that you trust him completely. He's coming into the presence of the Father, you always call him the Father, with complete trust and confidence, you see. And that's followed by the cheta, or the embrace. Then you embrace him, and you become one with him. You become his son. I have friends that say not only that they don't believe on such absurdity, but they don't believe for a minute that I believe on it. They say you can't believe on anything so silly. It's so far away, and we've got so far away from that. But when you're close to it, it becomes an obsession. What would you rather have? Would a man not give everything, you see, to have complete life, I mean abundant life, and live forever. What is the greatest of gifts? It's eternal life. When we say there's no such thing, well, they say there is, and of course you're obsessed with eternal life. If there's a chance for it, you'll do everything. And I think it's important that we have these records and go back to these early times to get us off dead center. What should we be looking for? First Nephi ends with 4 things. There are 4 things we should never look for. The first thing is gain, the second is power, the third is popularity, and the fourth is the lust of the flesh, it says. Those are the things, and they all go together. And those are the things everyone's looking for. Those are our objectives. When you say, well, what should be our objectives? Abraham, book of Abraham, that second verse says Abraham, what he was after, what he wanted. But now here's what he's after: greater happiness and peace and rest from me. So he seeks for the blessings of the fathers, and the right whereunto I should be ordained to administer the same, having been myself a follower of righteousness. Now obviously he is in on a tradition. We're dealing here with a sort of closed circle. Every time we mention these things, remember, we're dealing with a closed. You have to be an initiate. You have to be inside. These things can't be treated lightly. They have to be taken seriously. You see?
So this is kind of highlight everything that I just shared. When you're listening to Nibley, and when you listen to him talking about Egyptian temple motifs or motifs that are found within so-called funerary papyri, which are actually more akin to magic than anything else, there's a lot of things in there, such as the Ka gesture. For those who have participated in Latter-day Saint ordinances, that particular gesture will have ample amounts of meaning or at least, maybe not meaning, but at least familiarity. And so as he's explaining what all of this means to the Egyptians, the use of the Ka gesture, the raising up into higher worlds, and then embracing the god or goddess in question, this speaks very much to the contemporary Latter-day Saint temple practice. So as he's explaining how the Egyptians viewed it and analyzing the meaning of those ritual practices within Egypt, what he's actually alluding to is the Latter-day Saint temple practice, and trying to, again, give more depths of meaning, more depths of experience, a gnosis of God, of the cosmic drama that Latter-day Saints find themselves in through this temple, through these temple rites and practices. And so as such, as I contended before, and I will contend again, Nibley was not using these particular documents and rituals as evidence to prove Joseph Smith correct. Instead, he wanted to place Joseph Smith in the role of a Hierophant, and that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as in his view, is a contemporary mystery religion, a true mystery religion in Nibley's view, where gnosis is instilled and that initiates can learn to be an active participant in the cosmic dramas that the ancients understood, utilized, and that Joseph Smith restored. And this kind of gets into a bit more of my methodologies here that I use. And so this is kind of getting more into my scholarship and gripes that I might have with the Academy. The first one being that kind of getting back to Nick Literski's point about, as he participated in ceremonial magic, he was starting to see a lot of things and understand a lot of things that
just a reminder, use they. Pardon me, sorry.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, I'm so sorry. They. My apologies. So when they were explaining their engagement with ritual practice or with ceremonial magic, and that opened their minds to understanding the context and the meaning and the interpretations of all of these extremely esoteric and very difficult symbols, it opened their mind to really trying to understand Joseph Smith and Joseph Smith's world. And I try to do the same thing with my own work as I've studied Nibley and as I've read a lot of literature about Nibley, a lot of secondary literature about Nibley. I think that the biggest things that get missed about Nibley is that to quote Sterling Macmillan, when Sterling Macmillan was asked about Nibley, he said that Nibley possesses an inherent mystical element. Now, McMurrin used that term as in a polemical way. He did not view mystics very highly, and nor did he view Nibley's work that highly either, though he and Nibley were very good friends and he had deep respect for Nibley. McMurrin just didn't really like what Nibley was doing. And yet he highlights that Nibley's much more of a mystic than what he lets on. And that is exactly how I've seen Nibley and how Nibley has impacted me personally as I've come to understand that what he's driving for, again, is an exegesis of the Latter-day Saint temple and Latter-day Saint mantic experiences. And so I use people like Peter Kingsley within my work, he's a classicist who works with Parmenides and Empedocles, but his methods for engaging with the pre-Socratics, and even Carl Jung, he wrote a very beautiful book on Carl Jung called Catafalque, where he takes the worlds that that like Parmenides and Empedocles engaged in. He takes the cosmos that they present through their poetry and their lived experiences very seriously, because Parmenides was, according to the poetry that we have, received the gifts of logic that provided about the foundation of the so-called Western world, and even Plato, like Stephen Fleming just brought up Plato not that long ago. Plato borrowed a lot of these tools from his father Parmenides, as Peter Kingsley would call it. But those gifts were given to Parmenides through an encounter with the goddess Persephone in the underworld. And so Peter Kingsley's very much trying to push not just academia, but just the world in general to just be open to these types of experiences. And so, as I quoted him here in Catafalque when he's talking about Carl Jung, and of course, this also alludes, going back to Parmenides and Empedocles, where it was a simple task of bringing religion back from the realms of metaphysics and dogma to where it belongs, inside the human soul, inside human experiences with the divine, inside human, well, and even just the transformation of human into gods. I mean, that was one of the things that Parmenides and even Carl Jung, with his experiences in the Red Book, they have these very powerful and transformative experiences, and they come back no longer in their views, they come back no longer as humans, they come back as gods. And of course, my own mentor, Jeffrey Kripal, writes about this quite a bit, not just with authors and scholars, that, as he writes here in his book, The Secret Body, he wrote the book, The Serpent's Gift, as a self-conscious attempt, not just to write about scholars as closeted mystics, but to walk the talk and write mystical literature as scholarship. And, and this just gets more into methodological pluralism, which I won't bore you with here, so I think I will just call that good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marvelous. It looks like we have a little bit of time. I don't know whether Gabe is quite with us yet and ready to go, but just to give him a little time to get settled, would you entertain some questions?
Absolutely. I can
All right.
answer what I can.
Okay.
Let's see, I'm way behind on the chat, so if anyone has any questions that they put in the chat, I would appreciate if they just asked here.
Let's see. I'm trying to file through myself, and in the meantime, if anyone has a question who would like to pipe up, don't feel at all shy to do so.
Brandon, I did post a question, and I'll just kind of phrase it here. So while, like you, having read Nibley on my mission and afterwards, and buying the complete set and reading those over the years, I've always focused on what he wrote. I've never really focused on him himself. And so his first beginning slides kind of discussing, who he was, to me was fascinating. I'm interested in how you've reconstructed and what sources you're using to kind of reconstruct his beliefs and views.
His biography that was written by his son-in-law, Nibley, A Consecrated Life, is it's a resource that I've thumbed through dozens of times. I've even talked with, oh my goodness, his name just spaced me. Hold on, it's on my shelf. Boyd. Yeah, of course, Boyd Peterson.
Yeah.
So I actually got my undergrad at Utah Valley University, and while I didn't have the privilege of taking a class from Boyd, I knew some people who did, and so I was able to talk with Boyd a little bit. Of course, retrospectively, I wish I would have been much more thorough and much more better with my questions, as I was just, a snot-nosed, ignorant undergrad, and now I'm just a snot-nosed, ignorant PhD student. But Boyd offers a lot. Offers a lot of resources. I've even had lots of conversations about this with Joseph Spencer, who's in the process of working on a book on Hugh Nibley's views of the hierocentric state. It's going to be a very small book, but he's nevertheless been very helpful. And there are actually a lot. I mean, this is something that my advisor has been trying to set up for me, especially as I'm considering diving more into just doing Nibley scholarship. The BYU archives has a massive, I mean, first of all, they have all of Nibley's, he was really famous for writing little note cards, as a way of doing bibliographic information, because of course this was prior to the computer, and he himself was not a big fan of the computer when it was starting to become a bigger thing. But the BYU archives has all of his cards, as well as old manuscripts that were never published. Some of them were even very personal manuscripts that he wrote kind of for his own benefit, but that his family donated to BYU's archives shortly after his death. So these are things that I'm going to need to thumb through a bit more. But anyway, there's a lot out there.
Fantastic. And I probably have time for one more question if someone would like to ask Brandon a question.
I have a question if you can hear me.
I can hear you.
Yeah, so I was interested in the potential intersection of Hugh Nibley and ceremonial magic as based in Martha Beck's kind of recounts of potential abuse from Nibley that seemed to have a kind of Egyptian-based magical ceremonial context. I don't know if you have any insights there with respect to his engagement with the esoteric.
Outside of just intellectually engaging with the esoteric, so Martha Beck's claims are quite difficult to deal with. Not in the sense of dismissing Martha Beck or her experiences, but I mean, ever since she published that, she's had a big falling out with her family. Even with a lot of her siblings that are actually quite critical of Hugh Nibley, like Zina Peterson, for example, who is, well, I guess she's Boyd Peterson's ex at the moment. They divorced. Well, not at the moment. At this present moment. They divorced a few years ago, but Zina's always been rather critical of her father, especially because his father was rather distant. But she spoke out against Martha and said, we shared a room for our entire life and nothing like what Martha Beck claimed ever happened. And Martha also published this during a time when recovered memories were a very popular therapeutic tool. I know that that's something that a lot of psychologists and that use hypnotism have kind of moved away from. So in terms of Martha Beck's own claims, it's difficult for me to give much credence to them outside of just that was something that meant a lot to Martha Beck. But in terms of Nibley's own engagement with ritual magic, there's not much outside of just, as I've mentioned prior, doing a lot, like reading a lot of texts and doing a lot of exegesis or exegetical work on them, and offering up interpretations and things of that nature. The only ceremonial magic that he engaged in, as far as I know, is the Latter-day Saint Temple.
Could I break in for a second? Because what you've just said there is absolutely critical. And I'm going to offer a speculation that struck me some years ago after I read her account. And, understanding all of the difficulties involved, but also kind of, honoring her experience as her own. But, in the 1970s, and I think it was about 1978, Latter-day Saints were told to discontinue the practice of the true order of prayer in their own homes. And it was the case that I think that, endowed Latter-day Saint couples would have home altars and might actually wear their temple robes, the robes of the priesthood, at home and engage in the true order of prayer. And I'm sorry if I'm offending anyone by being too open about these sacred things, but I'm not necessarily convinced that, whatever Martha experienced didn't somehow relate to that. I mean, I would imagine if anyone, I can imagine, in all the world who cherished and valued the temple, I can only think that he would have, and his spouse probably would have joined in relishing the opportunity to engage in those practices. And I don't know for a fact that they did, but I think it's altogether plausible that might have had some influence on this memory.
Also adding a bit more to that as well, Hugh Nibley's home was a very, very popular place for family home evenings. Hugh Nibley's family home evenings were actually quite famous. And again, the engagement of the true order of prayer at home was probably very likely an aspect of that family home evening practice with students that came in. In fact, I do know one student. So I'm actually really glad you brought that up, because my Coptic professor at the University of Utah, Randall Stewart, he actually studied under Hugh Nibley while he was there, and would go to these family home evenings, and told me that very thing, that like they engaged in true order of prayer prior to jumping into whatever thing Nibley wanted to talk about during their family home evening.
Wow.
So I'm actually so again, while I don't look at Nibley's while I don't see Nibley as being a perpetrator of sexual abuse, I do think it might be possible that a student of his that was at these family home evenings was the perpetrator, and while Martha was really young. But again, it's hard to know exactly, because it's kind of something that with the family just doesn't talk about that anymore, because as soon as Martha said that was something that was like,
right,
nope.
So can I ask you, I'm sorry to break in, and we really do need to move on to Gabriel soon, but have you encountered I'm aware of, let me just preface this, but I don't know how many details I want to share. I'm aware of the existence of someone on the BYU faculty who kind of wandered off the reservation and was teaching higher teachings in the temple to research assistants. And, and I'm keeping people's names out of this because a lot of the people connected to this are personally known to me and near and dear to me. So I'm also not trafficking in gossip. But my understanding was that this particular group incorporated Hugh Nibley into their theology, and it was a sort of Gnostic Mormon temple oriented set of higher teachings. One of the things I really got out of your presentation was, I had not put together, because it's been so many years since I read my Nibley, that he was weaving in so much from these Gnostic texts into like the temple and the cosmos. So a person who really looked at Nibley as almost a prophetic figure in his own right might look at that, really taking these people taking Nibley almost exactly in the way that you've argued, but then perhaps taking a little bit, at least in the standard Latter-day Saint sense, too far. I mean, to me, what you've said is it's incredibly illuminating, partly because I have seen in the recent past some people also involved with like the snuffer movement, who have really embraced, and I'm not saying this is universally a snuffer phenomenon, but I have seen it among some people who are in that movement, embracing things Egyptian, and also embracing Hugh Nibley as almost like a prophetic or hierophantic figure. Have you run across anything like that in your own research?
Like meeting people that kind of use Nibley in that way. I guess
Or just knowledge of that. Has that crossed your path? In other words, is in the sense of lived religion in the present, is there, do you think, at least the possibility of a sociological aspect incorporating Nibley as a serious element of Latter-day Saints spirituality, whether it's taken too far or just within the bounds of normative LDS practice?
So most that I've encountered personally, because I think this is something that I would have to dig into further, especially as I'm looking at it more on the ground and seeing how your everyday Latter-day Saint reads Nibley, or even if they read Nibley at all.
Yeah.
Most of my experiences have been in the scholarly world, where, for example, I brought up Randall Stewart, who was my Coptic professor, and right next door to him was Margaret Toscano, who would also participate in these family home evening sessions.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so would her later husband, Paul
Yeah.
Toscano.
Oh, yeah. And
So,
they, by the way, they practice the true order of prayer. But
yeah,
I mean, and they've spoken about it, so I'm not sharing privileged information or
for sure.
confidences. Yeah.
So I've had some fascinating talks with Margaret. I mean, only a couple, where she's told me about her experiences with Nibley, because again, she was also one of Nibley's students. So a lot of my own experiences are just with people that have known Nibley personally, or that were just part of that BYU world when he was there, taking courses from him and things of that nature. And what's interesting about, I mean, obviously we know that Margaret was excommunicated along with her husband Paul,
Yeah.
one of the more famous excommunicants with the September 7th or September 6th. And then my professor Randall Stewart is no longer a practicing member, though he said, he always told me, like, he's like, when I brought Nibley to class one day, I think I was reading One Eternal Round at that time, but I had it in my bag. I had it in my bag, and I couldn't find my Coptic book, and so I pulled it out and was like looking for it. He's like, "Hey, I know that book." And it's like, so even though he had like nothing but negative things to say about the church, the organizational church, I mean, he was always telling me all types of stuff about things that he didn't like. But he always had positive things to say about Nibley, and just in his words, how magical of a person Nibley was.
Oh, yeah. No, I agree. I mean,
and so
yeah, I basically
then,
went to BYU to take courses with him, and I had the opportunity to do so. And wow, yeah, he was.
And I guess my closing point before we move on, because
Yeah, thank
people
you.
might be
Thank
tired
you.
of hearing
Someone
my
has to
voice.
exercise discipline here.
I know. So the Interpreter Foundation recently published a book called Nibley Observed. I'm not particularly a huge fan of how a lot of them interpret Nibley, but nevertheless, that book unto itself shows the magnitude of how Nibley is still
Yeah.
impacting and with a lot of these scholars today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you. This is, again, a very exciting presentation. I'm really eager to watch your research develop and look forward to the publications that come out of it. And I'm hoping they're numerous and receive the praise that I'm sure they'll deserve, because this is an area that really requires a lot of further cultivation, I think, among Mormon studies scholars. I really it's how long this has been fallow, and it needs to be cultivated. All right, but without further ado, let's move on to our next exciting speaker. And you'll have to pardon me, Gabriel. I'm guessing the pronunciation is Gabriel Proulx, and you can correct me now. Is that correct?
Yeah, very good.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I explained earlier, I had kind of a minor catastrophe in my world earlier today, so I didn't get time to work up a little bio. I was hoping that you might introduce yourself a little bit for us before you give us the title of your talk and launch into it. My apologies.
Sure. So my name is Gabe Proulx, and I'm also up here in Portland, Oregon. So Brandon and I have yet to meet in person, but been chatting, hopefully will. And I'm a bit of a newcomer to this space. Probably 2 years ago, I would not have been able to define esoteric or mysticism, or knew nothing of magic or consciousness or anything. My background is I'm a dentist. So my background is really more in the hard sciences, bioinformatics, bachelor's, computer science minor. So logic and hard sciences, materialism is always.
Are you excited for Taco Bell?
What's that? So hard science is always my go-to, and and kind of fell into exploring these things through even in the church, not much of not many what we consider spiritual experiences, certainly no like mystical experiences, and none of that really until leaving the church and getting into meditation, and some kind of surprising and unexpected mystical experiences endogenously, and then so then kind of circled back around, recontextualized Mormonism, and very interested in doing that. So I guess, do I have co-host?
Let me do that right now. Okay.
So I'm very interested in philosophy and consciousness, the overlap, the integration of spirituality and science. And I'm not sure if somebody posted in the group recently a really fascinating podcast about the overlap between AI, large language models, and magic. And so I find there really fascinating things coming out of that more computational approach. Stephen Wolfram's got some really fascinating things in the New Physics Project, where he's basically looking at reality from a computational approach, because he's a computer scientist and a physicist, and doesn't really have a background in philosophy, but ultimately, like, everything that he's concluding is lining up with esotericism and philosophy and consciousness. So that's kind of the approach I take.
Excellent. So I gave you co-hosting privileges. You should be able to co-host now. Share your screen.
See how to share my screen.
And by the way, I know lots of philosopher and mystic dentists, so you,
Oh,
you
really?
certainly wouldn't be the first or last. Yeah, there was a dentist in Salt Lake City whose book collection, I think after he passed away, ended up in one of the great used bookstores. And I think I took away at least 10 volumes. And if I'd had more money, I would have purchased more. He had a wonderful esoteric library.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I've had it's been a steep learning curve, which in some ways has been overwhelming, but also in other ways really useful because I don't know much of I don't have a lot of constructs. I didn't study philosophy, so have kind of gone into this through the back door, and then it's fascinating to take experiences and then realize oh, that's what this is talking about. That's where this connects up in terms of constructs.
Awesome.
All right, so my presentation is an integrative approach to Mormonism's history. I co-host a podcast, Mormons, Mystics, and Muons, trying to integrate spirituality, science, get away from a black and white view, friendly to both, safe and friendly to people, both from a believing perspective and not believing. Or on YouTube, I've got some more information at the end. But I co-host that with another guy who also, he's in a therapy counseling degree right now, very into Carl Jung. And so we kind of balance each other out in our interests. And yeah, the idea is just to try to integrate a bunch of different silos. So I want to start off, I had this idea of this parable of building a model airplane. And there's multiple different ways to tackle a model airplane. And it really depends on your knowledge and your needs, what you're interested in. So, someone who is just interested in it for display, they may not use the glue. They may just kind of press fit things together, put the decals on. They don't really need it to stay together or withstand a lot. It's going to sit in their shelf, and that's what they're interested in. Maybe they don't understand the glue. Maybe they have convinced themselves it's actually a desiccant. Maybe they don't like the smell of it. But for one reason or the other, they've put the kit together and left some pieces over. Somebody who's interested in trying to fly this model, they don't have any use for the decals, and it's simpler, easier. It makes no difference. Somebody who's really visually impaired, maybe they don't even use the wood. They just put decals on a poster, hang it on the wall, and for them, that suits their purpose. Somebody who's playing with it, isn't going to be interested or need to put the interior parts in it. And for each of those different perspectives or silos, it fits the needs of that person. It kind of fits their knowledge. It's maybe more simple, but when one of those encounters the other, somebody comes over who's flying their models, comes over to the house of somebody who's just has them on display, then they pick it up and try to throw it, and it collapses, or vice versa. Somebody who's very interested in displaying them goes to somebody who's functionally using them and just sees no decals on it. You see this disconnect between the different use cases. It's the same model, but they're putting it together differently. And so all those above approaches, they're leaving parts on a shelf, leaving them unaddressed, whether it's for convenience or just not knowing how to use the different parts. And this is the same thing with our approaches or cosmologies or narratives. They all represent both our knowledge and also our needs, what we want, religion or science, what we're looking for. And in the church, this happens with, it may work really well for one person, but it's going to be a different experience for somebody who maybe has an LGBT kid, and maybe there's a big difference between somebody who's prone to spiritual experiences and somebody who doesn't. So, and there's barriers to updating our approaches. For somebody who's been fine putting all their models together one way, it requires acquiring knowledge. It requires some initial more complexity to put things together. It's painful to start over. It takes time. But ultimately, at the end, as we as we progress on and maybe discover that we need our model to do more than what it did in the past, or we finally address the fact that we've left a bunch of parts laying on the table, we really need to integrate these different silos. And it's not just that when you use the glue and the decals and the wood, you use it all together, you don't have any parts left over that you've arrived, because that's just the kind of the starting step of integration. And then you can iterate from there, because there's always going to be refinements that you can do there. So ultimately, just because one doesn't know how to use all the pieces doesn't mean that it's isn't possible and that it's not useful. And then another parable that I thought about as I kind of updated my cosmology and been very interested in integrating different perspectives on reality, but on Mormonism. So consider we're 1,000 years in the future, post some AI apocalypse, and you've got 5 archaeologists individually finding different parts of the automobile, which doesn't exist anymore. Somebody found a transmission, another person a steering wheel, seat, tire, gas tank, not aware of each other's discoveries or work. They're each going to find their part, and they're going to come to several possible different explanations. They're probably going to have their own favorite explanation, and they're going to spend their time and effort honing that explanation and trying to have some biases that they may not be aware of, finding things that will support that. Each of them in their silo, they're either going to be really strongly convinced of their theory, or they may come to the conclusion that it's just impossible to conclude the true nature of this artifact. One person, they find the transmission, they may think it's part of a factory. Another person with the steering wheel thinks it's part of a boat. Someone with a seat thinks it's part of a rocket ship. But they each may have multiple different theories. Polling those 5 different archaeologists will likely leave you convinced that there's no consensus or no ability to find a consensus, because these are all experts. But if you take 5 new archaeologists, each of them being aware of all the works of the 5 siloed archaeologists, it's very likely, much more likely, that you're going to find a consensus that's not visible to somebody that's just familiar with the one silo. And in fact, integrating all the work will show that there are some, of all the 5 different explanations for the transmission, 5 for the steering wheel, seat, etc. You're going to find that there's probably one explanation of each of those that is compatible with amongst all the 5 parts. So ultimately, I think integration is the easiest path in the long run. It's kind of akin to supporting a table with one leg versus many. I mean, if you only have the one leg and you want to get the table up fast, you can do it, but you're going to have to hold it there. And it's going to wobble as people come to the table, use it for different things. You're going to have to keep adjusting. So actually integrating, finding more legs, it's difficult. You got to take the time to find the additional legs. But in the end, you're going to have a table that stands up without any outside support. And you may continually iterate those legs and strengthen them as you find more and more data. But ultimately, there comes a point where when you're in a silo, you get these diminishing returns, and it gets more and more difficult to come to a conclusion. But taking a step back and integrating multiple perspectives makes it much more easier to grok the bigger picture, because you get really stymied with these multiple theories within one silo. And this happens with science too. There's multiple different theories on quantum physics and consciousness, et cetera. And there seems to be an impasse if you're just familiar with one area. But if you actually take a look and look at the computational approach, biology, physics, you start to see that there's actually a kind of an overarching model that is consistent with all of them. So you're leveraging your familiarity with the multiple silos to more easily find that signal amongst the noise. You more easily rule out theories that aren't consistent with the other silos. And so this is what I see with the narratives of Mormonism. I read Method Infinite a couple months ago, which was amazing and really insightful, really brought to light for me just how deep the connections between Freemasonry and Mormonism is. listen to Stephen Fleming's talk on Neoplatonism, and I think there's a lot of overlap between Plato and this kind of some thoughts that I had even before encountering his work. There's also just the spiritual approach that we probably all came from. It is what it is. The narrative is consistent. Joseph Smith was a prophet. All these things happen as they were recorded or claimed. The pious fraud, I think there's a lot of merit in that. The entheogen theory. I read Cody Nakoni's book, and that was really helpful in me just understanding endogenous and exogenous altered states of consciousness. And then Michael Quinn's book on magic was also mind-blowing. But within each of these silos, Michael Quinn's book, it's fascinating that there's so much on magic, but no talk about kind of consciousness and psychoactive substances, which play such a large role of magic. And Method Infinite, again, not really, I've become familiar with Eastern philosophy and consciousness and meditation and esotericism. And for me, it's easy to see, Freemasonry, like, oh, this is kind of a Christian parallel to enlightenment or expanding awareness. And it's pops, once but that's not something that I really got out of that book. Same thing with Platonism. There's so many overlaps, but there's also some unexplained overlaps of how these other esoteric traditions and where is this a horizontal transfer of information where this group this person read this and was influenced by it, but there's a lot of vertical seeming translations where two people that didn't really likely have a connection seem to be putting together similar cosmologies. There's obviously internal inconsistencies with just the orthodox spiritual approach. With the pious fraud, I think to me it makes so much sense that Joseph Smith really believed much of what he taught. And I've listened to a little bit of Dan Vogel, haven't read his books, but I hear him talk about hallucinations. That he's not too keen on the entheogen hypothesis, and that it's really, really possible people have hallucinations, shared hallucinations, but really no addressing of like what, from a neuroscientific perspective, what are hallucinations, how, and really diving into how our perception of reality, how our brain works, is really a predictive model, and using Bayesian statistics of rendering a reality based on our experiences. And essentially we're living in a controlled kind of consensus hallucination to some degree. And so the entheogen hypothesis, I think there's a lot of support, even if it's circumstantial, but even that, as amazing as I found Cody Nakoni's book, there's a really big question that leaves there is like, what is the philosophical, the spiritual significance of the fact that there is a mystical experience that's readily available in psychedelics? So I think all of these, just as a silo, they leave a lot on the shelf that either intentionally or unintentionally, due to just not being aware of, aren't integrated, but all of them actually have a lot of overlap, and leveraging them all together to help round out those theories and iterate into closer and closer approximations of truth, because this is what science does. Science really doesn't claim to have big T truth. It's just, here are some models that help us understand, predict what we're experiencing, and that's ultimately what we do in spirituality and religion. So in terms of an integrative hypothesis or approach, first, I think we need to take out the black and white thinking. I see black and white thinking really reflecting a lack of awareness of what Stephen Wolfram would call our computational bounds as observers. Essentially, you don't know what you don't know, and it's really hard to grok a higher dimensional level of thinking. If anybody's read Flatlander, it's this idea. So just from an example of that, in 2 dimensions, if you had an observer that was only seeing in 2-dimensional space, looking at a coin, they're either going to be looking at the heads or the tail side, and they're have 2 observers looking at both sides of the coin, completely convinced that they understand and see reality, and hear the other person saying something exactly the opposite, and without that awareness that of the limitations or the possibility that there's a 3rd dimension, that just seems impossible, and you've reached a paradox. But the minute you can extend to the 3rd dimension, it integrates both perspectives, and they're both true. And the fact that they're both true is what creates this 3rd dimension. We also need to really revisit or understand myth. Alan Watts talks about a myth. We think of myth as a fairy tale or untrue, or has some connotation of not being real, quote unquote real. But really, Alan Watts talks about a myth is an image in terms of which we try to make sense of the world. And again, this is what science does. This is what religion does. But we're often not aware of that limitation, that we can't ultimately access big T truth. We're just going to approach it asymptotically. I think idealism plays a huge role in this. That's the perspective that I come at it from, which is a pretty hard shift from materialism. But idealism, the idea that monism all comes from one thing, and that building block of the universe is consciousness, and that through consciousness we experience matter. Similar to in your dreams, it's a conscious experience, and then through that experience of dreaming, you experience quote unquote matter. In that experience, you're absolutely sure that you experience matter, space, time. So idealism, there really is increasingly strong support from quantum physics, particularly quantum Bayesianism or cubism. Christopher Fuchs is the physicist, and that's a theory, a model that's gaining steam, and much more in the philosophical sense rather than the more materialistic sense. And Eastern philosophy, I think really is much more on the idealism side. Psychedelic research also, a lot of support as you analyze these experiences of people, both, that's what they're experiencing, and that's provides, I think a useful explanation for what these experiences are and the overlap. Physics in general, and even now biology. I was listening to Michael Levin, some interesting conversations. He's a biologist at Tufts, again, coming from a computational background, computer science background, computer engineering, and doing some really amazing things on morphogenesis of how cells form a collective consciousness and are able to create the bodies that they do, and how instead of micromanaging things, there's kind of this Platonic or these perfect forms of templates that they're using. And so even in biology, if you look close enough, and the key here, it's not so much about learning that's the difficult part, it's the unlearning is the difficult part. But even in biology, you start to see the support for idealism. I think idealism is so important because it provides a framework that supports both materialism. It's not that it's idealism or materialism, but it supports materialism as a heuristic simplification. So kind of this Russian nesting doll where just like quantum, just classical mechanics, classical physics, it's not that it's not true once we discovered quantum physics. It's just that we have a simplification that is really useful depending on the scale, the size, what you're working with. And materialism as well, it's not that materialism doesn't work. It's just that there are things that it's failing to explain, and materialism does work as a heuristic simplification of idealism. But idealism also provides a framework for universal consciousness, some sort of concept of channeling, expanding awareness, connecting to some source consciousness. From I think a pretty logical perspective, where you don't really have to tread in much of the woo, and you can still use it to come to some, I think, significant and helpful theories and models. And it also serves as an explanatory path for spiritual as well as paranormal phenomenon. I never really gave much thought to alien encounters, non-human intelligence. But as that's coming out more in the news, yeah, I realized, oh, these are very much more easily understood and integrated into logic and science. Understanding them as, you know, endogenous, essentially psychedelic experiences. You know, again, going back to how the neuroscience of works, you know, how our brains work is that it's essentially throwing up something on this screen of consciousness based off of what you've seen and the likelihood that you've seen it, and the sensory input that it's gaining. And so when you get sensory input that doesn't match what you've experienced before in your life, your predictive model pulls from myth, from fiction. And so there's some really fascinating takes on non-human intelligence from that perspective. Consciousness, I think, is the big elephant in the room for Freemasonry, which I'm certainly not an expert on. Occultism, magic, and theogens. So, you know, this is the common tie that Freemasonry, you know, from my exposure to it and reading Method Infinite, I was like, oh, this is an approach to expanding consciousness awareness, achieving higher states of conscious development, as well as, you know, I read Brian Morescu's Immortality Key, which makes I think a really powerful case for the use of psychedelics as the original sacrament and its role in Christianity and religion throughout the world. So I think seeing the overlap in consciousness, because it is such a difficult silo, and it's kind of the Wild West, the frontier in science, and it's often not brought up. You know, Michael Quinn's not going to bring it up in his book. And so it makes sense that, you know, we do need to develop these silos individually, but we also need to start transitioning to models that integrate them together and use all the parts in the kit. Also, you know, quantum physics, in one sense, it's a lot weirder than you think, but actually it's also much simpler. Again, this goes back to the big task is the unlearning of how we, you know, everything that we've come to understand, is taking a step back and questioning, well, is this a simplification of something that's actually, you know, is it a simplification of a deeper fundamental truth? And ultimately, it's really not, you know, it's moving away from the study of subatomic particles and much more towards a philosophical matter that is just most easily teased out of at that level, because it's much easier to see at these subtle levels. This is something, though, that often triggers people. You know, people are triggered by the woo, particularly really materialist and logical. I find people that have kind of swung away from spirituality and religion, really critical of Deepak Chopra or people, you know, within kind of New Age groups. There's a lot of, I guess, appropriation of quantum physics. But it's interesting because those that are triggered by that woo aspect really don't understand, you know, don't understand quantum physics, and as well as the history and just how woo its founding fathers were. You know, there are a lot of idealists there. Max Planck said, you know, consciousness is behind everything. Schrodinger, very, very interested and integrating Eastern philosophy with his science. And, you know, a lot of these insightful discoveries, you know, came from woo experiences. And then entheogens, you know, we're going through a psychedelic renaissance. And so it's bubbling up more and more, but it's really a rabbit hole that you really need to explore until you confront and, I think, address a few things. One, the philosophical significance of mystical experiences, as well as the overlap between endogenous and exogenous experiences. You know, research is really showing that the exogenous, you know, substance experience is very, very similar, whether you're talking about fMRI or qualitative a description of the experience, to endogenous experiences, whether it's religious or non-religious, but, you know, fasting, sensory deprivation, meditative states. So why is there that overlap? And then, I think you can follow that and really start discussing the integration of science and spirituality. So too often, I see people say, oh, yeah, the first vision makes sense because he was just on mushrooms. And for people that don't, and many people in Mormonism is pretty cloistered away from any real substantive experience with altered states of consciousness due to the prohibition of so many substances other than the spiritual experiences and that type of altered state of consciousness. And so for a believing member or somebody who's really orthodox in their belief to hear somebody else say, oh, the thing that's most precious to you is the result of a what they probably think is an illegal, immoral drug that they don't know anything or much about, really doesn't help either side come to understanding or further this understanding of spirituality, religion, Mormonism, what really happened. So with that in mind, kind of the 30,000 foot view, and I've got this in the second episode of the podcast and on Substack, I really dive more into kind of explaining all these silos and how they integrate. But, I think to me, it's pretty clear that Joseph Smith experienced expanded states of awareness, mystical states, whether it's endogenous, exogenous, whether it's from dissociative conditions resulting from childhood surgeries. I read pretty good. The Sword of Laban I found a fascinating book on that from a psychoanalytic view, but I found lacking because it really only relied on that view, but some fascinating things written by a plastic surgeon who had a lot of experience with kids who experienced significant trauma through burns. So whether it's from dissociative conditions resulting from that, entheogens, it doesn't really so much matter in the end, especially if you're aware of the research of how much overlap there is. I think I think it's clear that there are some Platonic ideas or this mystical experience, things, fundamental quote unquote truths that are filtered through his brain, his traumas, his beliefs. And this is how psychedelic experiences, mystical experiences happen. There's I think a really helpful model of our brain as a filter. And so these experiences, they often, they'll pick up and use the constructs that we have in our head. And that's why in these mystical experiences, Hindus can see Hindu gods and Catholics see the Virgin Mary. So you're really applying that to Joseph Smith and thinking about his traumas throughout his life and how that influenced what seems to have happened, I think is really helpful. To me, I think it's clear that he believed it. To what degree? Again, I don't know that it so much matters, but I think that it's really, I think it requires a fair amount of cognitive dissonance to really approach it from, it's a full-on fraud, from a narcissist. I think the Book of Mormon, in many ways, is very ununique in that there's a lot of similar works that, surprisingly, Mormons aren't really familiar. I'm surprised that Nibley's kind of challenge has been so uncontested or easily accepted, because there are so many similar books. And Radio Free Mormon did a excellent piece or maybe Mormonism Live, just comparing automatic writing. But I think the Book of Mormon really is helpful in that it's a really excellent peek into his psyche. If you see the themes in his life and how they manifest in the Book of Mormon, especially when you consider the automatic writing, if you're not viewing it from a metaphysical perspective, it was used in therapy and is often a reflection of the individual's subconscious. So whether you want to just localize that to an individual subconscious or a collective unconscious, I think it's still helpful either perspective. So I think there's likely no gold plates, but again, if you understand or have experienced altered states of consciousness, you really do understand how one could see plates, or see, I think it was a frog or a toad that turned into a spirit, see all these and really believe these things, and then even not obtain them in the 3D world, but then still be able to come to a likely belief that you're still receiving and being transmitted an actual record of actual people. So again, I think if you're not familiar with these things, you may be inclined to jump into one of these camps. So everything's true, or everything's a fraud, because you just can't really figure out how could somebody produce this, maybe have prop plates, but believe it, because that just doesn't seem logical without understanding how real many of these experiences are. So I think this helps us realize that the experiences of those in church history, I think we should treat them as genuine, or very likely genuine, as are many experiences in the church today. I think the fact that so many experiences were group experiences really does likely point to entheogens. And so from that perspective, maybe it is helpful to know whether this is endogenous or exogenous. But it's much harder to produce shared altered states of consciousness without exogenous means. But I think it's really, I think we're just trading one shelf for the other when we switch and say, well, all of these early Mormons, this was a made-up experience, or they must be in coots. And I think that's not something that really is addressed in CES letter, or the most common approaches to deconstructing or diving deeper into Mormonism's history. Well, I think Mormonism was original Mormonism was an impressive integration of esotericism. And I think it's a really excellent case study on some of these things, like automatic writing or entheogens as a sacrament in religion. I do think it was poorly integrated. Stan Groff talks about the shamanic initiation crisis when he talks about the spiritual emergencies, and I thought a lot about Joseph Smith during that. But one of his keys is, if you go through the shamanic initiation crisis, where you descend into hell, the key is coming back and integrating yourself back into society. And I think what we see happening towards the later end of towards the end of Joseph's life, I don't think that was fully integrated. He was fully integrated back in. But I think today's Mormonism is a really vestigial form. But despite that, or maybe even because of that, the esoteric roots are increasingly resurfacing in a spectrum of healthiness or unhealthiness. With Denver Snuffer, I see a lot of, these are exogenous or endogenous experiences, mystical experiences that really researched well in science, or becoming better researched. But with Lori Vallow, Chad Daybell, Tim Ballard, Visions of Glory stuff, it's really fascinating to see these things bubble up, with the vast majority of people just having no clue, like, where does the New Age come into Mormonism? But I think it will continue to bubble up from the collective unconscious until we can integrate it. But I think that this bubbling up is owed to the fundamental truths about consciousness and mystical experiences and reality, and not to Mormonism's truth, because it is easy to start to go down this path and see these esoteric connections and be like, oh, this proves the orthodox belief there. So why does this matter? People are seeking, and I think increasingly dissatisfied in both ends of the orthodoxy spectrum. So you see a lot of people leaving, swinging towards atheism or agnosticism, against spirituality. And you also see people swing the other direction, leaving and becoming more extreme in their beliefs, and conspiratorial in their beliefs about the current Mormon Church. Non-ordinary states of consciousness, they're not discussed in Western culture, or they haven't been very much, and are very much pathologized. And so increased polarization, guilt and shame, trauma, from religion, these all create often a pressure towards altered states of consciousness, or towards disillusioned. And, over and over again, I think we're seeing people in spiritual emergencies with these altered states of consciousness, and very unable to integrate them. That was part of my journey, was experiencing things that were really bizarre, that I had no awareness of, or way to contextualize, but luckily I had a friend that was very familiar with this realm, and was a very beautiful learning experience and growth experience for me. But again, these aren't things that we talk about And if we do talk about that, they're within the context of often either psychopathology or religion, spirituality, or religion. So I think people, I find, often end up either one, experiencing really difficult non-ordinary states of consciousness without the proper container to integrate, ending up very vulnerable to extremism. I had two guys from my mission that created a cult and married each other's kids, and they're now in jail. Their story, again, involved synchronicities, bizarre altered states of consciousness, thinking like, well, there must be a reason that it's happening to us. We must be prophets. Or the other path, I think they get disillusioned and unfortunately swing, fully from religion, even against spirituality, into science, which seems like a safe haven, but science is having its own, crisis. I think in quantum physics and in AI, it's not as safe of ground as we might think. So I think the current narratives are really siloed, either promoting a really literal view or utilizing a really simplistic alternative element to explain things away, be it narcissism, Freemasonry, entheogens, elevation emotions, trying to resting, that whole table on that one leg, and often, unfortunately, dismisses spirituality, which we're learning is a key part of mental health and our experience as humans. And so then this is finally, this is kind of some more the details or I think the breadcrumbs that, if you look at things, require a more integrative approach, because just looking at one of these silos, it's hard to really explain all these things. So these are some of the things from that Substack piece of the episode 2 of the podcast. So there's a lot of overlap between what was known about the Eleusinian mysteries during Joseph Smith's time, which likely involved entheogens, and the temple endowment that he instituted, as well as the overlaps with Freemasonry. The Eleusinian mysteries were even mentioned in The Messenger and the Advocate in 1837, although critically. Joseph Smith reportedly taught reincarnation to several people, including plural wives in the late Nauvoo era, and a couple, church leaders continue to teach reincarnation, multiple moral probations. Really fascinating. Find one of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts, the Apocalypse of James, was discovered in the 1940s, and interestingly has Christ teaching passwords to James, essentially to give to the archons, or these kind of semi-demon angels, I guess, when he dies, so that he can escape essentially the matrix that the demiurge has trapped them in. So really similar to the temple ceremony. Priesthood and Reiki, which is an energy healing modality out of Japan, have a lot of similarities. Reiki started with a mystical experience, except for the fact that Reiki actually has several studies supporting its efficacy, including a systematic review, which is the highest form of evidence-based medicine. The concept of collab is an interesting one that I haven't seen really anywhere else to this degree. Concept of collab and the council in heaven is very similar to the New Age concept of Sirius, being a star system with advanced life forms, consciousness. These star seeds are these consciousnesses from Sirius that choose to incarnate here on Earth to raise Earth's consciousness to get us through this transition point. So KLB is the Hebrew word for dog. Sirius is the dog star, and Sirius is one of the most important stars to Egypt, where the Book of Mormon was allegedly from. And maybe these may not all be hits, but I think it's really fascinating, the overlaps. And I don't think New Age people were copying Joseph Smith's note. So it's interesting to wonder why the overlap here. Early church leaders were really animistic in their views. A lot of talk about Earth being a living organism, the sun being a living organism, the concept of Zion being one heart, being of one heart and one mind, really similar to other spiritual and scientific teachings of collective consciousness. Patriarchal blessings are really similar to the New Age concept of Akashic records or channeling in general. I've got friends that read Akashic records and definitely can tell that they really believe what they're doing. They're not frauds, not doing for money. I've had some interesting experience with those. There's also an interesting fMRI study where they took Brazilian, I think, spirit writers, I forget the name, people that wrote communicating saying they communicate with spirits, and on the fMRI, the motor and the language centers of their brain essentially diminished, shut down when they were doing what should be requiring the activity of those areas. Burning in the bosom is really similar to experiences people describe in transcendent experiences or with the concept of Kundalini energy. And so that's, I just think it's important to try to integrate these things. And there may be plenty of things that I put together that need iteration. But I think as we try to integrate these and use all the parts in the kit, that we'll get more and more internally consistent models that can help us understand and help people navigate faith transitions, navigate their personal journey towards meaning. And ultimately, I think through this approach, there's actually a lot more similarity from all the sides. There is an overlap in the Venn diagram. So we've got the podcast, I said, it co-hosts Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. It's on Apple, Spotify, and YouTube. Episode 2 is really the episode that goes over this kind of whole narrative. And then it's also on a Substack in written form there. So thank you for letting me present.
Wonderful. Thank you. Are you willing to entertain questions? We have a couple in the chat. I know I spotted some from Clinton. Let's see.
So more comments than
Okay,
questions.
yeah.
So one of the things you brought up was the shared vision experiences that existed in kind of the corpus of Joseph Smith's history, right? And one of the things you suggest, and I don't suggest that you're wrong here, but you suggested that they're best explained through entheogens, right? Entheogens. One suggestion here would be, I think you would find interesting, is an exploration of the Western mystery tradition of path working, because these type of shared experiences, especially in those type of works, are very, very common. Having experienced a couple of those type of sessions, 20, 30, 40 people having very similar experiences and visions through path working without the use of drugs is very common. Other comment here was you brought up the mention of the Eleusinian mysteries that is mentioned in the church periodical. As someone who studied the Freemasonic tradition quite a bit, the discussion of the Eleusinian mysteries as well as the other mysteries was a very, very, very common topic in Masonic literature that was written at the time, and good suggestion that that type of stuff was influencing Joseph. So kind of more side comments.
Yeah, and I definitely think that shared altered states of consciousness, are a thing. And you see it. I'm not an expert in any way on, like non-human intelligence, alien encounters, but I'm convinced that many of those fall under these type of experiences, and that often happens. I don't think it's too common that non-human intelligence, alien encounters involve substances. So I think it's definitely possible. I think there's, again, this is kind of approaching integrating multiple styles. I think there's other circumstantial evidence or facts that, in Kirtland, they've got people that are in different states of consciousness for like a day or two, which I think is consistent with Datura, which is used in, spiritual work in indigenous cultures. So yeah, I don't think that we will, or I don't know that we'll have direct evidence of entheogens, but I think there's enough circumstantial thing that I think it's highly probable, but I don't think it's necessary. But I think it doesn't really matter so much because whether it's endogenous or exogenous, I think the real question is like, what's the philosophical, spiritual, scientific significance of the fact that there is a mystical experience that people have been having for thousands of years, regardless of culture and path. Thanks.
Other questions? Alex Criddle had an interesting comment in the chat. I mean, Alex, do you want to say anything more about that to the group than the little snippet you put in the chat?
I'm not quite sure what more to say.
Okay.
Other than, I mean, we've got a few leads that I'm working on tracking down on things that we can physically test for the substances. And I mean, I think, yeah, Don Bradley talked about this in our mutual Sunstone presentation this past July, that we're hoping to eventually do archaeological work to test to see if Amanita muscaria was present on the Smith family farm in Tunbridge, and so that we can link their Lucy's experience that we think was likely Amanita muscaria with the presence of it there. But so we've got all sorts of lines of physical evidence that we're trying to track down.
Yeah. And to connect it all together, Brian Murarescu's archaeologist will hopefully be your archaeologist in testing that kind of material. So Andrew Coe. So that's exciting. The sooner that happens, the better.
Is he the guy? Was he on Mormon Stories, Andrew Coe?
No. He's just he's a archaeologist who works at the Yale Peabody Museum, and he's spearheading an initiative to study ancient pharmacology and psychedelics.
I thought there was a couple episodes of Mormon Stories that's had an archaeologist with the last name of Coe talking about the kind of lack of support of archaeology.
No, that's a different guy. No, he's a Mesoamerican archaeologist. Andrew Coe actually is a Bronze Age Mediterranean archaeologist, but he specializes specifically in testing the chemical traces that are left in ancient vessels. And so it gives him the expertise to dig in and find out very specific information about substances that were used in a past context that you can recover through archaeology. And no, but I know who you're talking about. Yeah, very different guy. Andrew Coe's a much younger fellow. Well, I say much younger. He's my age. So maybe I'm flattering myself, much younger. A good question. But yeah, if you want to check that out, it's our Sunstone session back in July, and
listen to your guys' panel.
I mean, both Alex and Don have so many amazing and enlightening things to say. It's great to check out. Now, there's one thing I wanted to ask you, if it's okay, and that's, I really love your integrative approach. I mean, I think it's incredibly fruitful, and I think you've got a number of natural allies out there in the world who've either participated in some way in the Mormon experience or are Mormon adjacent, and of course outside of the Mormon orbit as well. But the one thing that I keep wrestling with, and I know you've addressed this, and you did so, and I thought a very positive way. But for me, it's like it's this term pious fraud, and you included that, and I don't fault you for it at all, because I think it's a term that's so powerful in a way that it captures a lot, and there's definitely a built-in ambiguity to the term, and yet I always find that it's in another way it can be kind of reductive, because people they like to the fraud comes second, And I think we have a tendency cognitively to kind of listen to that more, because it's such a powerful word. And so I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about that, because it seemed like in a way you were implicitly wrestling with the term in your presentation. And have you like thought of other ways of capturing what you see in Joseph Smith? And I'm not saying to in the sense of exonerate or whitewash, but I mean, in my view, kind of try to narrow down what's happening there more accurately in a more nuanced way without that kind of emotional flag being thrown in the air that I think distracts people.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think it's funny, and it's very reductive if we like approach this as like, did Joseph Smith believe what he was doing or not, as though he was in a binary state. We often do this when we think of people, narcissists, whatever, is this a good person or an evil person? Like, and then you realize, from your own inner experience, and as somebody who went through, pretty profound, what would qualify in psychology research as spontaneous spiritual awakening with very mystical endogenous experiences, you realize, like you go back and forth between thinking you're crazy and other people think you're crazy, and then like having this deep noetic knowledge. And so it's not a very binary thing. And so it's I don't think it's helpful to try to put him in a box of like, did he believe or did he not believe? Because most things are on a spectrum. And again, you look at psychology and you see the phenomena of dissociative identity disorder, and you realize like, here is a well-documented example of one consciousness being two very different egos, and going back and forth. And so I think, I read the Sword of Laban, and I have very mixed feelings about Joseph Smith. I related a lot to him during, my experiences were really tough to integrate and difficult. I was like, this is what he like, this no man knows my history. I wouldn't believe it if I didn't experience myself. All these things, like I was like, okay, I see where, is that also very, very angry and horrified at the, abuse of power and what happened along with polygamy. And then at the same time, coming from a religion with such purity culture and guilt and shame from normal, healthy activities, like I understood. And that, so I mean, I and anytime, at the same time that I'm furious and angry and frustrated, I also reading the Sword of Laban, also at the same time, have been almost in tears at time thinking about, my 6-year-old kid going through horrific unanesthetized surgery, 3 times. And that is the trauma that shaped his brain, and, the destitute. So I have a lot of compassion, as well as frustration. And I think it's I think it's very complex, and it's hard to know where what he believed stopped and what he wasn't sure or wanted to believe ended, or started. And the more you know about narcissism, which, I think he definitely had traits, and that's also something that, as somebody with people close to me that have that, it also comes down, I'm very compassionate about that. It comes down to shame, and self-worth, but familiarity with that from a psychological and, attachment perspective. You see how, the things that they say the most and are the things they're trying to convince themselves the most of. I read one of the legal things on Tim Ballard, and it ended with like the top, the most common things that Tim Ballard would say. And if you read them and realize like, oh, these are the things that he's trying to convince himself of, because he needs these things to be true. He needs these things to be true so that he feels okay. So yeah, I think it's a spectrum and changing probably from moment to moment. But I think that understanding consciousness, understanding mystical experiences, psychedelic experiences, endogenous or exogenous, allow us to at least have another alternative of this is how somebody can be experiencing something that feels and seems realer than real. And actually, according to science, neuroscience, and philosophy, like what is real anyway?
Yeah.
I think that it at least allows us to have a middle ground or open up more possibilities.
Yeah, and I don't, sorry to, and I think I very quickly moved to allowing others to chime in and ask their questions, but I had this conversation with Don Bradley years ago, and I think he almost got, at the time, he got really angry with me, but over time he forgave me for it because he is a wonderful person. But I kind of pushed back at him at the time, and you have to understand that his views have changed very much. He was really enamored of like diagnosing Joseph Smith as a narcissist, but let's all forgive him, for that. Because, and I'm not saying that you're doing that. Let me also make sure that I understand that as well. But I do find is one of the characters that I'm currently studying a lot. I'm a Roman historian, and I'm studying probably the most psychologized emperor in all of Roman history right now, Caligula. And, there are articles written with all of these theories about what caused Caligula to be crazy. And as a point of fact here, if you understand ancient historiography, you'll come to the conclusion very quickly, and that is the art of writing history as it was practiced in the ancient world, that you can't rely on anything that these guys are saying, that in the way that you would reduce them to data that you would crunch into a psychological manual, a DSM or something, and say, oh, well, we can see that Caligula had these specific diagnoses. And that is because, and this is, I think, a huge point to mull over for all of us as we study these things, is that the terms that we apply are really a product of our own historical horizon. They're the way that we understand the world. And that's not to say that they're utterly random and valueless, but I think it can temper our confidence. And really, you have to excuse me, Gabe, when I say this, because this is not a rebuttal of you or a response to what you said, but it's more of me musing here right now with terms like pious fraud or with terms like narcissism. We've come up with these terms, and they have a surprising moral punch to them, right? Because what people want to do, and I understand because I've been there. I was raised LDS, mission, temple marriage, all that stuff, is that we want to find good and reject bad. And it's interesting how even terms that we think are scientific or, based in rationality can very quickly justify us in saying Joseph Smith bad, which is not at all the topic that you're talking about. You're actually doing the exact opposite. And yet it's interesting to me that the power of these terms is, in a way, grudgingly acknowledged by you. That they're so powerful, they have to be addressed. They're elephants in the room. And yet I would say, let's really interrogate psychologizing Joseph Smith when, look, the DSM manual is changing all the time. Now, look at where we are today as a culture, or where we're arriving as a culture slowly on issues like gender. Well, 30 or 40 years ago, homosexuality would have been in the DSM as an illness, a mental illness. So what confidence do we have then, recognizing this fluidity in our own scientific views of the human mind, that Joseph Smith is a narcissist? Now, let me not say at the same time that I'm saying Joseph Smith is a saint and never did anything wrong. But what I'm saying is narcissist is a sneaky way of pretending we're not morally judging Joseph Smith, but calling on the guys in lab coats to come in and condemn him for us, and then saying, see, I was right, he's a turd. Excuse my language, but this isn't what the problem I have with that is. Not that I want Joseph Smith to be a lamb and a saint and a perfect person. It's that I feel like I've clouded up the topic again. I feel like I have illuminated something when really I've just sort of plopped my own new blanket over the topic that makes me feel nice and comfy, but hasn't maybe not illuminated anything. Whereas I would say the virtue of what you are advocating here is, this integrative approach that frankly is almost in some ways reflective of some of Joseph Smith's own nobler sentiments and aspirations, which I find really interesting. So I'll get off my soapbox here and let others take over.
Yeah, but I think you speak to the paradoxical relationship that we have to have with constructs, in that we have to at the same time recognize that they are meaningless and are only have meaning from what we attribute to it, but they're also useful too. And so we have to use labels to try to build higher and understand things, but we also have to at the same time be deconstructing. And so I think there's two approaches to quote unquote truth too. There are people that have abandoned any attachment to what they want to be true, what's convenient to be true, what eliminates suffering for them, and they will do their data collection to support what they want to be true. And that's how I approach my doubts often, up until a certain point. And then there's another approach where there's a non-attached approach, and then there's the approach that you're trying to support what you want to.
And I like that non-attached, because I think and this is just a very general comment that I probably speaks as much to the health of one's own psychology as anything else. Trying to hold on to something too tightly in the end is not going to be, I think, productive on just a personal human level. That allowing for some play and not taking a subject in a death grip and insisting that things have to be the way you think they are is much better, because of course life experience is going to prove us wrong over and over and over again. And if we don't reconcile ourselves to that experience that we're having, then I don't think it's healthy for us. And that may be a funny thing to say in a somewhat academic gathering, but I really think what I like about what you've said today is it's in a way what you're saying is both philosophical and almost pastoral, because I think you do have an interest in seeing people land in a more fruitful and healthy place in their personal journeys. So thank you for that. Other questions? All right. Well, I don't want to break up till I have the Zoom until 10:30. If you have any other questions, just raise them now or in the chat. But I'd like to thank Gabe again, Gabe Proulx, for a wonderful presentation. I thought that was fantastic. And thanks everybody for coming this evening. I know it wasn't planned far in advance, with a lot of formality and foresight on my part, but I really am so pleased and humbled by the number of people that we got here tonight, the wonderful speakers. Each installment we've had, and we've had a few now, has been really a revelation to me of all that has been done that I've been unaware of, all that continues to be done and will continue to be done, to really kind of open up our understanding of the Mormon tradition, past, present, and future. Because I think that Mormonism is understood within this sort of Western esoteric, or just generally esoteric construct, is a fruitful and promising way to approach Mormonism, whether it's from a purely intellectual perspective, scholarly perspective, or even a spiritual one. And so even though I kind of lean in the academic direction myself, I do like the sort of, in a way, the model of a divinity school where both of those sides are brought together. And so we deliberately seek to keep the scholarly and the spiritual in the same place here. So if there are no other comments, let's call this to a close and thank everyone again for being here. I will, when this recording is processed, I'll put it up on YouTube. If you have a particular preference as one of the speakers for how you would like your piece to be put up on YouTube, whether you would prefer to put it up yourself in your own venue, my philosophy is that I'm recording this, but you retain all the rights over your presentation. So just keep that in mind, whether you've presented today or you plan to present in the future. If you don't want it online, it won't go online. If you want to put it up in your own way, you can do that. If you're happy to allow me to put it on YouTube, then I'm grateful for that opportunity. Stay tuned in the coming weeks. I want to bat around the idea of maybe formalizing this a little bit more, getting more people involved in a sort of organizational role, nothing too formal, but rather than here's Trevor inviting people to give talks, kind of get more people involved, and I think it'll go a lot better if more people are involved to help, just to keep me honest, for one thing, so to speak. I don't want to claim that I'm not being honest, but anyway, so thank you guys. Have a wonderful evening. Thanks again to our 4 speakers. Gabe, I'm glad you made it. I hope your trip here was safe. And thank you so much for making that extra effort and coming in to make sure that we heard this. And check out this podcast. It's Mystics, Mormons, and Muons. Mormons, Mystics, and okay. I'm sorry, I got that. Mormons, Mystics, and Muons. Check out the podcast. I'm going to be checking it out. I'm excited to see all that you have to say on the podcast, Gabe. So thanks, guys.
Yeah, Alex is on episode, so have a good discussion.
We got another reason to listen. Alex is on. All right. Good evening, guys. Take care. Goodbye.
Thanks, Trevor and Gabe. Yeah, really enjoyed the conference, and yeah, thanks for making this happen, Trevor.
Oh, thank you, Claire. It's good to see you.
Good to see you. Good to see you too.
Recording stops.